So that was introduction. Introduction, dusty as hell, bombs everywhere, and mortared the first night. So welcome to Nui Dat. I thought this is going to be fun.
As far as looking forward to going back to Vietnam, what was it that you were looking forward to?
To be the leader of a patrol. That was the creme de la creme. That's still the creme de la creme job at SAS, a patrol commander. And they sent it in a light fire team. A light fire team is 2 helicopter gunships. They come in and blast the place up. So we threw smoke, indicating where we were, red smoke. The smoke's drifting up through the trees, and we're sitting in the smoke, and the gunships are brassing up each side of us. Quite scary, and all the expended shells are falling on our heads and God knows what.
Did you ever have any close calls where you thought that you weren't going to survive?
Oh yeah, numerous times. At the end of the patrol, the Viet Cong caught them on their in their last LUP and killed 2 and wounded 3. Sitting there with their thumb up their bums, not paying attention, and they got caught. And every time our patrols hit them, they hit them big time. And I think the body count was over 550 Viet Cong to only one of ours. So not bad ratio.
How long did you train at Incompetent?
A couple of months, 3 months maybe.
Did you enjoy it while you were there?
Yeah, but like I said, it was something you endured. You were there with your mates you'd met a couple of months ago, and you were going to go and serve together, and you were looking forward to the next stage.
Had you made some mates by this point?
Oh yeah, but all the mates I had from Kapuka were there with us. They were the same blokes. And then my world changed dramatically from that moment, when I saw a bloke walking down the road with a sandy beret on. 2 guys, 2 fairly big, very fit-looking blokes in polyester uniform, wearing these sandy berets. I said, who the hell are those blokes? And they said, oh, they're SAS. They're here for their selection board. I said, oh, what the hell's SAS? I thought it must have been, they said, oh, Special Air Service. And I must have thought it must have been some sort of Air Force unit or something. I'd never heard of it. Unbelievably, I'd never heard of it. Even though I'd lived and breathed army stuff for years, the SAS were under the radar. They'd been formed in 1957, and they were a commando unit basically. So the boss of our platoon, this sergeant, I can't think of his name, came around and said, righto, they're calling for names for interview. Who wants to go and be interviewed by the SAS selection board? And we all put our hands up. Yeah, we'll be in this, you know, get out of whatever we're doing today or tomorrow, whatever it was. And it always had a lag aspect about it, you know, if you volunteered to do that, meant you wouldn't have to, you know, go out the bush, or you wouldn't have to do something else onerous. So we all fronted up, and you walked into this room, and there was 3, a pretty senior NCO, a warrant officer, a major, and a psychiatrist or a psychologist sitting there at the table. And you had to sit there in front of them, and they'd then grill you.
What sort of things?
What do you want to know about SAS? So what do you know about SAS? Why do you want to do this? What is your reason? Some bloke said, oh, just to get out of here, or, you know, and they'd have all the information on you prior to you coming in the door. Your education standard, your IQ standard, all that stuff. And they knew exactly who you were, and your age, and your fitness, and your... And out you went, and I never heard any more about it for a day or so. And then... Did
you think you did well at the time?
Well, no. I thought, dreadful interview, you know. I'd never been really before interviews before at that stage. I was only 19. And next guy went in, next guy, and so on and so on. And we all went through, and we all upped the boozer that night talking about it and saying, oh, you know, see that bloke, see the gongs he had? And one bloke had Malaya, Borneo, Vietnam, infantry combat, and all that sort of stuff. And we were pretty impressed by the SAS place. Old Tommy Marshall was the major, I found out years later. He came through the ranks in SAS, and he was a major. Can't think of who the other 2 were. But a day or so later, word came down that the following people will be going to Perth to do the SAS selection course, and my name was on the list.
How many were selected?
4 from our platoon, 4 from another platoon, 5 from another platoon, and 4 for 21. It was basically 24 on the draft. And when we got there, no, there were 20, because when we got there were 6 others from other corps and things, Ordnance Corps, artillery, there was one guy from artillery. And we all just, but we were in two minds initially, because we all of a sudden weren't going to the 7th Battalion with the rest of our mates. But we had this other adventure with Perth. I've never been to Perth in my life. I've never been out of New South Wales, actually. Well, in those days, all train travel too, see. So you hopped on the train and away you went, and it was fantastic, you know. Pulling up in Melbourne, and Melbourne was closed. Pulling up in Adelaide, I get to Adelaide on a Sunday, and Adelaide was always closed on a Sunday. And finally we got to Perth, across the Nullarbor. I just couldn't believe looking out the window for days on end at the Nullarbor. God, gee. But we got to Perth and met at the station by Blue Corsten, Sergeant Blue Corsten, who was dressed in absolutely spit polished gear, you know, green, very fit looking guy with a SAS Bureau. He threw us on a truck and took us out to Swanbourne. We'd been shayaking each other all the way across, saying, oh, I'll give myself a day. I'll give myself 2 days before they kick me out of here, you know. I don't think I'll do very well.
Have some of your good mates been drafted with you?
Yeah, yeah.
So you're not completely...
No, the guy I met on the first day, Rod Wallace, him and I were both on the draft. Guys from other platoons, Alan Ingram, GD Smith, old GD. There were a lot of guys there that were mates. It was good. But Rod was my main mate at that stage. He was really good. He topped Kapooka and he topped Ingleburn. You know, he was going places, old Rod.
With the blokes who didn't make it into the draft, were they really up and positive about you being
selected?
selected?
Yeah. One was killed in Vietnam, Timmy Cutcliffe. The rest all went to 7th Battalion and performed very well on their tour in Vietnam. A lot of them, most of them got out, but the guys went on a draft. It's quite an interesting draft, actually. Out of the 26 people that started on that course, something like 16 ended up warrant officers in SAS.
Gee.
Sergeants or warrant officers in SAS. Amazing.
They must have done something right when they were selecting
people. Well, it's called a paper board. They select, you fill in all the boxes, put education away, IQ away, fitness, attitude, all that stuff. Put all that away without having to worry about retesting it or putting people through diabolical torture for 6 weeks. Then you got it shot to bits. Out of that course, only one bloke didn't get through, and he's the artillery bloke who they lit off a bomb out in the bush one morning about 5:30 to get us up. You know, they always threw whiz bangs in the bush. Get up! You know, that was Ravelli. They got up and put your running gear on, a pair of boots, trousers, and a singlet, and you'd go for a run down the bottom of the hill. This is down at Collie. You'd run all the way down to the bottom of the hill and run back. That was the morning run. Anyway, this bloke yelled out, "Get stuffed!" or something. We went off on our run, and we got back. This guy had been packed up on a vehicle and sent back to Perth and thrown out of the unit, just like that.
Gee.
Never saw him again to this day. He's an artillery bloke, but I don't think he would have gone very well. He had no intention of doing anything he was told, I think. But it was good. We trained and we...
Well, what immediately happened after you arrived in Perth?
Well, we drove out to Swanbourne Barracks, Campbell Barracks, and in those days, the Campbell Barracks that we'd heard about were basically bulldozed, and they built these... well, actually, there was a big sandhill there, and they bulldozed it and built brand new accommodation blocks for the 3 squadrons. SAS had 3 combat squadrons in those days. They'd already served in Borneo with 2 squadrons, 1 and 2, but Vietnam had come along in 1965, and they raised a 3rd squadron called 3 SAS Squadron, and it went to Vietnam first. So those guys from that first squadron were just coming back off leave as we arrived. So they were given the job of running our selection course. It wasn't called a selection course in those days. It was called a cadre course, C-A-D-R-E, or cadre as the Americans say it. The cadre course was basically designed to teach young soldiers how to be SAS soldiers in about 6 weeks. My mentor, who's still a very close friend of mine today, Chris Jennison, he'd already served in the British Army. He served in Borneo and Vietnam. And this guy was the guru. He taught us more about how to be an SAS soldier than any man alive. And all the Bart Mavericks and Ken Bowens and Mick Malones all had this guy as our teacher. And it was fantastic. He chain smoked. He's a little pommy bloke with a baldy head, and he had absolutely no pretensions about anything to do with dress, bearing, drill, parade grounds, any of that stuff. Didn't give a stuff about any of that stuff. His main role in life was to teach us to survive in the bush, basically. So we went through the front gate of the barracks and taken up to there was 2 barrack blocks on top of the hill, which were used to house the regiments. Don't forget at this stage, but a squadron's already away in Vietnam. 3 squadrons just come home. They've just been replaced by 1 squadron. And so there was a combat squadron just back, so only half of them were there. There was a squadron away, and a squadron getting ready to go, so they'd be at the bush or in New Guinea or wherever. So there was plenty of room in the 2 barrack blocks, so we were put in East and West block were the 2 blocks. And we basically started life in there for a few days until we moved down to the back of the rifle range to the old huts down there.
Is it comfortable?
No, it was World War II stuff again. We thought, and we weren't allowed to go anywhere near the place except we ate our meals in the diggers' mess, the brand new diggers' mess.
Apart from that, you're in really bad.
We were basically ignored. We weren't, but all we could see is SAS berets walking around at a distance. We had nothing to do with them. Then we got down the range and we fired on the range. We went down to Collie on trucks and we basically broke up into small 4 to 5 man patrols and learned how to be SAS soldiers.
How was that actually taught?
Each senior NCO or corporal that was allocated to a patrol would take you out the bush from the main base camp, and you'd just do stuff. You'd do fire and movement. You'd move quietly through the bush. You'd do navigation. You'd do track crossings again. We all knew how to do track crossings from our earlier experiences. Nothing really was much different. And you bonded. You bonded in the patrols. Those patrols didn't mean much though, because you weren't going to be in those patrols back in the regiment. You basically went where they told you back in the unit, and you filled holes. Guys being wounded or sick or left the army. And this went on for about 6 weeks, and we plugged away, then all of a sudden they said, that's it. And I turned around to my mate, Bart Maverick, and who is still my mate today, and I said, is that all there is? Because high school was harder than that. But we then went back to the barracks. We had a bit of leave, a couple of days off. They then packed us up on a train and sent us back to the eastern states to do a parachute course at Williamtown.
Did they give you some sort of progress about how well you were doing?
Oh yeah, they rolled in and they said, righto, you did okay. Your navigation's a bit crap. You need to sort this out, but you should be okay.
Is that what they said to you?
Yeah, and there's a book in the regiment called the Red Book. And many years later, when I was second in command of the squadron, I was able to get the Red Book out of the safe, and I looked up the comments against my name. It was positive. A keen young soldier. That's all it said. Each man in the book, and there are hundreds and hundreds of names in this book, has a single sentence or a single line comment or a word. Some of them are not very good, some are very good. Yeah, it was good to know that, but I was the bloke who was signing our course reports. was one of the great heroes, of course, Wally Marshall. Wally Marshall was running the training squadron at the time, and he was a military medal winner from Timor with a second fourth commando. He was an old man at that stage, needless to say. Wally was a major, and he'd won an MM. He was one of their heroes, sort of thing. And he was old Wally. Not very good navigating, young fella. And I said, yeah, I'll get better. So I was only 19. I wasn't a very good soldier, really. I was just, making up the numbers sometimes. Other times I did okay, So we went off on our parachute course on the train, the Rattler, to Kalgoorlie.
The Rattler?
I used to call it the Rattler. That was the rattle and banged its way all the way to Kalgoorlie. And then you got on the trans at Kalgoorlie.
What did you think about your ability to
well,
parachute?
At this stage, I'm still young enough to have a go at anything,
Yeah.
So we get there, and
Where is the parachute course?
Williamtown in New South Wales, up near Newcastle. Used to be a big air base up there. There still is an air base there, actually. And the parachute course is run by the Air Force, parachute training flight. And you had all these Air Force people and Australian Army parachute jump instructors, and everyone was very, very overawed by all this stuff. But you walk into the classroom on the first day, they put you in the barracks, and the next day at 8 o'clock in the classroom, there's a big sign on the notice board: knowledge dispels fear. So that was basically the way it was. You learnt how to be a parachutist before you became a parachutist. They put you up in the swing trainers, and they put you up in the Polish tower and swung you off, and you did landing after landing after landing.
How long has it been up to get to that point?
A couple of weeks.
So they've really...
Oh, they do. They really pump it into you. But the instructors were sensational. They knew exactly what they were doing, and we all basically got through it. And you do 8 jumps.
Anybody fail with parachute?
Oh yeah, a few of them. There are people from other units on our course too, and some of those guys never made it through. Some of our guys never made it through. But one of my mates off my selection course did the 8 parachute jumps on his course. But when we got back to the regiment, a couple of months later, it wasn't a couple of months later, about a couple of weeks later, we did a parachute jump with the regiment. He refused to jump, so he got kicked out of the unit straight away.
How did you celebrate graduating from the parachute course?
Grog. Got into the grog. But don't forget, we're still only 19. At this stage, no, wrong, I was 20 at this stage. So I turned 20 in April, and this selection course was July. So towards the end of the year on the parachute course, yeah, so I was 20. But we're still under the age to be able to drink, but everyone drank, especially in uniform. In those days, you went everywhere in uniform. But we drank a bit of grog. I caught up with my father in Sydney on the way back. Went home and said g'day to Mum and Dad, and caught the train back to WA. What
did they think about this SAS deal?
Yeah, they were pretty proud of me. I think my mother and father's main reason in life, reason to live, was for their kids to just do the best they can with what's given to them, and I'd already let them down at school in terms of my academic performance, but I was doing the best I could here. I was in Australia's top combat unit, and the myths and everything that abounded around SAS were quite strong, and you felt very proud to be there.
What sort of rumours were being bandied about when you were?
Nothing much. It's just this aura, this je ne sais quoi, this certain something. The SAS boys would, and they've proven it in Iraq recently, and Afghanistan and Timor and Vietnam. We only lost 7 men in the whole 7 years, and only 1 to enemy action, which is a record that no one else can. Well, I dispatched over 500 Viet Cong. But it was just that certain something, and I think people aspired to serve there. And I've often said to people over the years that if you serve for 25 years in SAS, in the army, and have never aspired to serve an SAS, then you've wasted your time. You really have. And many years later, I did the Regimental Sergeant Major's course, the RSM's course, and I served with some very good soldiers. But they were so limited in their thinking about soldiering. Digging holes at high range up in Townsville was as good as it got, you know, and it was a tragedy, really. Some of those guys would have made very good SAS soldiers. But, you know, you can't do everyone in the unit, you know, someone's got to do the donkey work too.
So how did other SAS blokes welcome you new blokes when you arrived in Perth?
Well, we came off our parachute course. The truck picked us up at the railway station again and back to the lines, but now we were parachute qualified. The blokes didn't care much about it. You know, you saw them in the mess, there you go, and, you know. But laconically, they didn't. No one broke out the massed bands or the champagne. It was just another bunch of blokes, and they'd run the pencil over you fairly closely. They'd look at you and think, oh, they like to look at that bloke. Or the only thing you could ever wish for, the highest accolade you could ever wish for in the military, was to have a good soldier, a proven good soldier, say to someone else, he's not a bad hand. That was the highest accolade. Though you kept it low profile, you stayed under the radar, but we had more to do. So we were allocated to 3 Squadron, and they were the downtime squadron. They were the squadron that had just got back from Vietnam, and all their guys were away on courses and leave and getting married. And the ones that were allocated to run our selection course, they basically still had us under tow. And they said, righto, the next set of courses are the signals course. The signals course was a hard course. It was all Morse based, Morse code, because that was the main high frequency communication SA used to use, even up until 10 years ago.
Jay.
Still using Morse. Because Morse will cut through, right through all atmospherics and distance and God knows what. And so the signals course started, and it was towards the end of the signals course. We went for about 2 months. It was just torture. And a lot of us had a lot of trouble with it. We had this wonderful teacher called Barry Smith, 152 Signal Squadron bloke, who's passed away. He really stuck with us. We were just dreadful. And he stuck with us and said, right, you blokes, you're going to be SIGs by the time this ends, otherwise, you know. And he was right. He made us SIGs. All of a sudden, it started to happen. You started to remember. You can start taking down Morse. You only had to take 8 words a minute. And the best I ever got in the army was taking about 12 words a minute. But the core signal people, the people who actually do Morse code stuff for a job, some of those guys are taking 25 words a minute. Real fast stuff, you know, and they're working a full group behind. And God. So I didn't aspire to be one of them. I was just a grunt SIG, as those irreverent bloody 152 blokes we used to call chooks. 152 Screaming Chook Squadron, that was their name. They were given somewhere along the line. But they were outstanding. They taught us, they backed us up in the bush. We worked back to them in communication centres. And in Vietnam, they saved our bacon so many times, you know, ridiculous. But towards the end of the signals course, and we're all just starting to get it, and morale was starting to rise, somebody said, I wonder how we get one of these berets. We expected to be issued the thing, you know. You see the blokes putting their berets on at a jaunty angle, and you think, when are we getting these? Anyway, someone said, oh, you got to go up the queue store. So we all trooped up the queue store and stood there at the counter, basically trying on berets till we found the one that fit, put a badge on it, signed our name on the bit of paper, and walked out. And walked back down to the squadron with these berets on. It was like, you know, like winning the lottery. But the fact is they made no song and dance about issuing it, no song and dance about presenting it or anything. We were just automatically entitled to it, which is a bit of a shame. Nowadays they make huge fuss. They have the families in, they have a big parade, they have the whole shooting match.
So it wasn't almost an anticlimax?
Oh, it was very anticlimactic, yeah, very much so. But it didn't worry us too much. We just wrapped to have it. And it was sort of like up to that stage, we kept thinking, hang on, we're still on the selection course here. Nowadays, they actually do all that stuff before they issue the beret. The bloke will do his selection course, and then he'll do all the other courses, parachuting, signals, everything, for 12 months, and then they issue the beret at the end. So we were basically the forerunners for what happens now, actually. But at the end of their selection cycle now, they have a big parade. They have all the families, and they make speeches, and they have the Governor General, and, you know, if he's in town. And it's a pretty big deal. So it's a bit of a shame, but it was just good to get it on the head. And then we were basically in the unit, and we were posted to, after the signals training finished, we were posted to a troop. I was posted to L Troop 3 Squadron.
Just before your posting, is there any more detail you could go into about the SIGs training?
Signal training was just torturously hard. It's like trying to learn another language. It's just like language training, where you just cannot pick up the vowels, you cannot pick up the nouns and the verbs, you just don't understand how it all fits. Then all of a sudden one day you do. And that's what Morse training was like. You had to just know the alphabet, and you just have to hear it. Did it, sort of I-M-I. It means say again. You know, many years later, well, not many years later, but months later, I still couldn't pick that. I could pick the basic stuff, but once you were posted to a patrol, in a troop, in a squadron, and I was posted as a SIG, because I was trained Morse. And I went to Vietnam as a signaller, but that's another story.
Equipment did you do your SIG training on?
We had, well, as we arrived at the unit, we used to use the old 510 set, which is a double pouch HF set, high frequency. High frequency is skywave, where you're actually bouncing the signal off the ionosphere. VHF, very high frequency, is line of sight. And UHF, which we use later on also, is extreme line of sight. In other words, me to you, or me to a chopper. It's a little handheld thing. But if you want to guarantee comms, communications, comms, you used HF. And you put up a suitable, either if you're in New Guinea, you wanted to talk to Perth, you had to use a quarter wavelength dipole. And the dipole was basically cut, or when I say cut, or measured with a feeder in the centre and angled at the right angle so that the signal was being thrown out like that, with a feeder coming down to your radio, and away you went. Half wavelength dipole, quarter wavelength dipole, or full wavelength dipole, just depending on distance. And you could use those in the mountains because the signal was thrown straight up into the atmosphere and back down again. Whereas HF, you couldn't, VHF, you couldn't do any of it. Ironically, in Vietnam, later on, we carried all three radios in a 4-man patrol. VHF, HF and UHF, unbelievably.
Would a man carry one of those each?
Yeah, yep. So we had those radios. We had 10 sets, which were a dreadful VHF radio. They were pretty awful damn things. They were little skinny, long, tall, skinny radio. They were no good. And then we got the 77 set in. The 77 set was a VHF radio. It was still line of sight, but it had a big whip aerial, which meant that the line of sight could go a lot further. And that was basically it, those two radios. And we never worried about the big radios, the communicators, the signals used back in the communication centre. The big Collins receivers and those sorts of things, that was their bag. We didn't want to, we had too much to worry about just learning Morse, let alone trying to work into the other intricacies of being a signaller into it.
Were you taught the maintenance and repair of these?
Not really, no. No maintenance. Maintenance, yeah, you clean it up and batteries and how to check batteries and stuff like that, but nothing, no maintenance. When I say no repair. Radios, we had radio techs who repaired all that. They were posted to the squadron.
Would they be on patrols with you as well?
No. If you lost your comms in the bush, fairly simple process. If you didn't get comms, so you missed a sked, basically the balloon would go up. If you missed 2, they'd be out looking for you. No problem. That's when your other radios come into play, talking straight to the chopper.
Is the sked a scheduled com?
Yep, sked. Yeah, you had normally 1 or 2 skeds a day, depending on what patrols you're on. But so the signals course was basically all that. You learnt about communication networks and who was working to who. You learnt the language, voice language. 1, 2, this is 1, 3, radio check over, and all this.
Can you share a bit more of that radio language?
Not really. I'm a Reggie Sig. You're better off getting a Cora Sig like Possum Bramley on here to talk about it. He was one of the best too, old Possum. But it's just a language. Voice language was easy enough. Wait. You had to understand what each aspect was. Wait means just wait. But wait out means you were off the radio and you're going to get back to him. Out means you're out. It was gone. The communication is finished. And pack up and move, sort of thing. But I don't think I ever, later on in combat, I don't think I ever got a voice message through. It was always Morse.
Why would that have been?
Well, just the way it happened. We'd throw out we used to use a vastly different radio in Vietnam, a little 64 set, a 4-channel 0.5 of a watt in amperage. 4-channel HF radio, a little tiny thing about this big with a lid on it. It had a little ear plug and it was a miniature compared to the other things we used to use. They had a voice facility on it, but we never ever got it to work. But the Morse facility worked pretty well. We used the 510 Morse key with the 64 set. Our SIGs adapted the plugs. The 510 key had a rounded top on it, and you could roll your fingers on and off, and some guys got really good at their Morse by using the 510 key. And we all had our own keys. And one of the big no-nos in signals, of course, is idiosyncrasy. You never let idiosyncratic stuff crop into your work because the enemy can pick you up. There he is again. That's the same bloke that uses a double wait out or a double out, or So you learned all that stuff, and you learnt codes. You learned how to use codes. The main code was the OTLP, one-time letter pad, which is the safest code in the world even today, because you're working book to book. I've got a book in my pocket of code pages. The signal centre's got my duplicate book back there. So when they're decoding my message, they're using the duplicate book back there, and I'm using my book here. So as long as we're on the same page, then it's laughing. So if I lose my book or my book gets captured, they just destroy the other one. There's no 2 books in the world the same. So it's just about impossible. Well, it is still impossible to break. It's just an embassy code used by everybody.
So they wouldn't be codes that you'd be able to memorise then? You don't follow them?
No. You memorise other bits of your code, your indicator groups and stuff. You memorise that stuff. You're issued those by your signal centre, a little card or something, or you tried to memorise them. So basically, what page to go to on what day, where to start, what line to start on. Codes are fascinating things. They really are fascinating. And but if you get them wrong, you're out by 1 letter in a line. Nothing makes sense. Nothing. So you've got to get it right. Encryption and decryption is cool.
Did that cause much anxiety for you as a signal?
Very much. Very much. Unless you understand exactly what you're doing and you double check it. So in Vietnam, later the patrol commander would say, righto, we'll get comms at the next stop. The afternoon sked will do it early, or we'll do it at the right time. He'll say, I'll work out where we are. He'll hand the message to the signaller, which is me. Encrypt this. So you encrypt it onto the pad. You turn it into the code you want to send in Morse, and away you go. You come up on the radio and say, basically, our call sign in Vietnam was Bravo 9 Sierra, and each patrol, Bravo 9 Sierra 1-1, 1-2, 1-3, or 1, that's I troop, and 2-2, 2-2, 2-2, 2-3, 2-4 would be J troop, and the 4s were L troop, which is our troop. So Bravo 9 Sierra 4-1, or Bravo 9 Sierra 4-4 on my patrol command. And you come up in clear on those, and you're offered your message in clear, or you're offered the offering of the message over, and then you'd send the message in code, and they would then decrypt it out of the book you left back there. And basically, the intelligence you wanted to tell them would be then moved down to the headquarters in Nui Dat and passed on to the intelligence people and the brigadier and whatever else they want to make of it. So that's what. But it was just a lock stat or location statement. Then that'd be coded too. Of course, you didn't want the enemy to know where you were. You wouldn't never send a 6-figure grid reference in plain, you know. I think we basically overestimated what the Viet Cong had. I don't think they had the ability to intercept any of our messages, quite frankly. But we never knew. See? There were reports around the place that Russians had been seen in the bush, or big Caucasian sort of men with Viet Cong groups. Maybe it was true. The Cold War was on, see. The Cold War was flat strap. So maybe the Russians were in there. Maybe it was a danger. But I always got the feeling that we only ever captured 1 or 2 radios ever in 7 years. Charlie never carried radios. So did he have direction finding equipment? Did he have anything to interdict our signals or not? We never knew. But we always had to assume he did. Oh no, the signals job was a good job in that in a good patrol, the signals people around you, or the people around you would make brews for you, or make your lunch or feed. Or a bad patrol commander would basically is communicated to get comms in the rain, whatever, put out aerials, pull in aerials, get packed up, and then say, right, move in 5. And you haven't had a brew, and you haven't had, you know, that's a bad patrol commander would do that. I didn't know many of those. Most of them generally had their act together. The signaller had to be looked after because he was carrying a heavy weight, and also while you were sitting there with mind in neutral, he was getting comms.
You're his contact with Task Force headquarters. You're his contact with Task Force headquarters. Contact with the squadron
communications centre. We never worked to Task Force headquarters. We just worked to the squadron. And there's a good photo in my book there of the SAS Communications Centre or room, which I never saw the inside of while I was there because we weren't allowed in there. It was a need to know. You never needed to be in there, so you never went in there. And we used to send sit reps, lock stats, ambush reports, contact reports, all sorts of stuff. You're sitting on a track on an OP, observation post, and you're watching 300 VC walk by with everyone armed to the teeth with big packs, and the patrol commander's madly scribbling stuff down. He's scribbling stuff, direction they're going, how many weapons, tactics if he saw any, like if they're on the ball or whether they're just moving quickly, estimated speed of move, because if they're going like mad down a footpad, and by the time you get comms, pull back, get comms, and tell the task force or tell the squadron, it might be an hour. He can walk 2 or 3 Ks in an hour. You know, they've got to react fairly quickly. So the SAS eyes and ears were the eyes and ears of the task force, basically. And you had to get comms quickly. But signalling was it was an interesting. We got to New Guinea later on. I'll tell you about it in a second. We got to New Guinea after being in the squadron for a while, and went off on a medical course and did a few other courses like Assault Pioneer, which is demolitions and things. And by the time we got to New Guinea, each squadron went to New Guinea for a couple of months as a workup for Vietnam. I was the signaller. And the chooks used to call me No Comms Malone. But I got better. By the time it came to the sharp end, I got comms when the shit hit the fan.
Why were they driving you like that?
It's just the chooks. We shyaking each other all the time. That's just the way it was. You know?
If we just pause there for a minute, do you want to grab a glass of water at all?
I do.
Mick? Yeah.
I don't get to talk very much these days.
So when you joined the squadron, they called you no comms Malone?
No, the bloody SIGs, a lot of times I never got comms in New Guinea. Whether it was to do with aerials or, you do aerial theory, you understand how aerials work, but you can't judge it. Your ionospherics might be down on that day, or low or high, or, you just can't pick it. And you might be bouncing a signal straight over the top. So if they didn't get your comms on a quarter wavelength dipole, they'd give you a mouthful of cheek when you got back, no comms Malone. But I proved them wrong later. I got comms in Vietnam when it mattered.
So what was the trip to New Guinea for?
Every squadron went to New Guinea to train in the mountains for Vietnam in the jungle. We trained, we did a long stomp, we did a 110-mile walk. Some patrols went from Asiki to Salamar, others went from Manyamia to Balolo, others went from Samoa to Asiki, all that stuff. And you basically crossed the Owen Stanley Ranges. Well, not as bad as the Kokoda Track or anything, but bloody yamas. I've never seen yamas like it. You go up, and you just see daylight, and you think, oh, there's the top. And it's a false crest, and up she goes again. And you're in the clouds, for God's sake. Anyway, we all did those. It was a bonding exercise thing for each patrol. But I went okay. We went home and we flew back to Australia, and we went on pre-embarkation leave. It was a couple of weeks leave before you went to Vietnam, and back again.
How did you spend that?
I went home to Mum and Dad's place. It was around Christmas time, I think, 1968. And we got back to the squadron and we painted our trunks. We had to put all the code things, a triangle with yellow trunk with a triangle on it with 3 bars indicating our squadron or whatever, and your name and all that stuff had to go, and you had to get all your gear ready. You had to be issued tropical issue stuff and millbank filters and all this sort of stuff. And we're in the process of working our way up to getting going. We were doing some pretty heavy range shoots and stuff like that. I was in the Boozer one night up a Great Big Club, and the phone rang, and I answered it, Kelly's Woodyard, and it's my father on the phone. And he said, I want to speak to Mick Malone. And I said, speaking. And it was pretty noisy in the Boozer. The boys are getting stuck into it. And he said, Peter's been killed in Vietnam. Peter, my cousin. And I was horrified, of course, because it was just unbelievable. Unbelievable, firstly, my father would ring me about anything. Poor old Dad wasn't heavily into writing or ringing people up. But Peter being killed, and I'm about to leave in 3 weeks. So it was a bit of a touch and go situation. I think my grandmother wasn't that happy to have his father, Terry Malone, Peter's father, who Peter was killed. Terry was in Vietnam at the same time. He was up there as a warrant officer in the training team in Hoi An, which is up near the border. He was a warrant officer training Vietnamese tank crews. And Peter was in the Armoured Corps down in Phuoc Tuy province and got killed on Operation Goodwood. And I'm about to leave. So needless to say, I got wheeled in and asked the question, do you want to go or not? I said, what are you talking about? Of course I want to go. So that was put to bed, and 3 weeks later we left. We flew into Singapore. We had to wear white shirts. They had to take our polyester shirts off and wear a white shirt with a tie with our army trousers in the Singapore terminal. We looked like a half-trained Latter-day Saints missionaries. We had our white shirts on, but not the black trousers. I don't know why, but the Singapore government weren't that happy with us transiting through or something. Something like that. So we went by 707, of course. Flew straight from Perth to Vietnam. Most of the other guys went by C-130 or the HMAS Sydney, which was the troop carrier. But we didn't have to endure that, thank God.
What was the flight like?
It was just a good flight, 6 or 7 hours. All of a sudden, you're in Vietnam. I was like a mad cat. And we flew into Ton Son Nhut Air Base in Saigon. Huge air base. We were lined up behind F-105s, Phantoms, C-130s, all lining up trying to land one behind the other. It was a very busy airfield. The busiest airfield in the world at that stage. So we landed in the Qantas 707 on the 18th of February 1969, and we met at the airport and by bus, and as we were getting off the plane there was another squadron getting on it, so we had our jaws down here just with apprehension and excitement, and the squadron we were replacing had big grins on their faces going home. 12 months later I understood all about that.
Were there any exchanges between you?
Oh yeah. A lot of the Borneo blokes who knew each other. Our senior NCOs in 3 Squadron knew each other, but I didn't know any of the young guys, any of the guys that were going home.
Was there any shot acting?
Oh yeah, big time.
What kind of things were they saying?
Look at you lot, there's no VC left, we've killed them all, and all that sort of stuff. But generally it was, they were just desperate to get on the plane and get home. And we just arrived, so we bussed us across to the Australian airfield. We actually flew to, no we didn't, we flew from Saigon by Australian Caribou aircraft, Wallaby Airlines they call them, to Nui Dat and landed at Luscombe Field. Luscombe Field was a big airstrip right there in the middle of Nui Dat. And it was like the Pilbara. It was red dust and dirt everywhere. It was dry season and it was just horrible. It was dry as a tick, dry as a bone. And Vietnam's a terrible place for that. It dries out extremely, just completely and utterly dries out. There's not an ounce of water anywhere in the dry season. And the wet season just pours. So if we had landed at Wittenoom, you wouldn't have known the difference. It was so dusty and so red.
Were you surprised?
Oh yeah, very surprised. I didn't think it'd be that dry, But it was so hot and so torturous. Oh no. The trucks were there waiting to pick us up and drove us basically around the hill and back up to the hill, top of the hill where SAS base was. And we were shown our lines, our tent lines.
Can you describe them?
Well, they were pretty horrible actually. The squadron prior to us had lived there. They lived pretty rough actually. All the sandbags were all rotting. They'd taken over someone else's lines when they moved up there. The squadron before them had moved. No work really had been done on the place at all. And there were weapons, and the day before we arrived, the ammunition dump at Nui Dat blew up and killed two ammunition blokes, and the whole of the base was showered with grenades and shells and God knows what. Anyway, they were everywhere, and there were sandbags sitting on top of them all over the place. There must have been 50 of them around the lines, and you weren't allowed to touch them because they were UXBs, unexploded, or UXOs, unexploded ordnance. So that was day one. Then on the first night, we got rocketed or mortared, and we had to stand to. Stand to, yell out stand to, and everyone gets their stand to positions in the bunkers or helmets on. And guys running around no clothes on with just a pair of boots, a rifle and a helmet. Yeah. So that was the introduction. Dusty as hell, bombs everywhere, and then mortared the first night. So welcome to Nui Dat. I thought this is going to be fun.
You're expecting more of the same?
Oh yeah, well, it's the sort of thing you think, God, how often does this happen? Every night or every... But it calmed down and we settled into our lines, and we were briefed by the patrol commanders who'd all flown up earlier on the advance party. And we did some shakedown patrols around the place in the barracks, in the lines themselves.
What were they?
The shakedowns, just shaking yourself out in your patrols, and we issued new cams and American boots and all the different bits and pieces. American rations weren't much good in the dry season because the only thing good in the American sea rations was the pound, a tin of pound cake in there. It was the fluffiest cake you'd ever. Your grandmother couldn't make cake as fluffy. It was in a tin. Americans had some weird rations, and their meat was so salty you couldn't eat it. But the wet season, we had these alert packs, long-range reconnaissance patrol packs, which came in a big satchel like this. And there were 2 dehydrated meals in each pack, and they were huge. Chili con carne. Never heard of chili con carne before. Chili con carne. I'll have some of that. And away we went. So the dry season, the first patrols were shakedown patrols, a couple of days in benign areas. They didn't want you to send you into some area and get your arse shot off day one. Down to the range, basically a tour of the New Edad area. Don't forget there was 8,000 troops in this one area around the hill. The hill's where we lived on top, and the area was surrounded by rubber trees, and the battalions were placed in the rubber. 2 or 3 battalions there at that time. Plus the reinforcement unit, which was saw thousands of men come through that, replacing wounded and killed guys in the battalions. Plus the tanks had a specific area, and the armoured personnel carrier mob had another area. And then the headquarters itself was down in another bit of rubber, down near the Wombat water point. The first SAS squadron to go to Vietnam actually lived in one-man tents just next to the headquarters until the hill became available, and they moved up there. But we had the best bit of real estate, but the worst bit about it, we had this huge bloody aerial sticking up over the top with lights on it, so the airplanes wouldn't run into it. And the Charlie thought we were the headquarters, didn't they? So that's why we kept getting mortared and rocketed. So
what was on the perimeter of the task force?
Well, when the Battle of Long Tan happened in '66, 3 years before, they hadn't set any wire or anything. They hadn't, and what Long Tan was D445 Battalion were massing for an assault on the Australian Task Force headquarters, and they were bumped by D Company 6 Battalion, and luckily, as it turned out, Harry Smith's mob basically walked straight into them. And then they didn't blunder into them. They followed up a couple of contact. They followed up a couple of guys and bang straight into this lot. And she was on for young and old. But there was no wire out at this stage. When we got there in '69, though, the wire was fairly thick and heavy and not as bad as the Somme, but getting that way, we layer upon layer of wire. I'm talking about triple concertina and bastard wire and all sorts of stuff, and everything covered by machine guns and Claymore mines. And so Charlie, by the time we got there, Charlie would be well advised not to attack the Dat. It was a fairly heavily fortified place. But he used to sit out in the bush and just throw the odd rocket and the odd mortar in, just bolt.
What risk were you at of being hit by one of those mortars?
No, very little risk. We were pretty safe in the Dat. We had a boozer there and we used to get absolutely smashed in the boozer. But later on they brought in the old 2 can per day perhaps policy, which was a bit of a disaster. We used to get into it. We had VB. VB was the beer of choice. And at one stage the Americans would offer us 3 cartons for 1 carton of VB. 3 cartons of Pabst Blue Ribbon or Bud or Coors or whatever they had, because their beers was weak as water. But VB was the beer of choice. It was a ripper. But some of the other beers, like Charlie Waddell, remember Charlie, was it Tom Waddell or Charlie the cheap grocer? We used to have a grocer here in Perth here called Tom the Cheap.
I don't remember him.
Well, it was like an action, or Tom the Cheap Grocer. Well, he sent a pallet of Swan beer up for us. A pallet, fantastic. It was undrinkable. It was not drinkable. It was just rubbish. Either something happened in transit or the preservatives were wrong or something. He just could not give it away. And he couldn't give it away. The blokes just wouldn't drink it. But VB was just sensational. And, you'd go up in the afternoon, you'd finish work cutting grass or digging bunkers or building. They decided to revet our lines. You know what revetment is? pull down all the sandbags and build concrete revetments with corrugated iron and star pickets and wire, and every tent would be basically fully revetted. So if a mortar bomb landed just outside it, you could be asleep in your bed and not get killed. The only way you get killed would be a direct hit sort of thing. A bit like revetments around armament points and aircraft revetments on airfields.
So the mortars were starting to pose a bit of a threat?
Oh no, they landed around the place, but yeah, I suppose, but you had to occupy soldiers' minds when you weren't out in the bush. Don't forget the basic daily routine would be reveille at 6 o'clock. Everyone would be up anyway because it's so bloody hot. Square away your room, maybe, which is 3 guys in each tent and an officer on his own in a tent, and sergeants 2 per tent. Square away your room, have a shave. Everyone just wore boots and shorts, no shirts. You had to wear a shirt to breakfast. So you go down to the mess for breakfast. There was a building with a kitchen and a mess hall on the other side of the road, basically.
All under canvas, was it?
No, they'd built actually buildings at this stage, wooden buildings with tin corrugated roofs. And you'd have your breakfast and go back to the lines, and whatever job was on that day, whether you were going on a sandbag trip down to the local sandbag thing, or whether you preparing for patrol, you might get a warning order. The patrol commander will come down the path with a bit of paper and say, "Warning order, boys." A warning order basically tells a patrol, warning a patrol out, we're getting ready for patrol in 3 days. So, yeah, we used to get 3-day warning order, which allowed you to then do all the briefings, draw all the rations and special equipment you might need, whether it's cameras, binoculars, pistols, whatever you needed. All the different weapons, whether you're doing claymore ambushing or down to the range to test all your weapons, down to talk to the Air Force about where you're going in and all that sort of stuff. Then you get dressed and cammed up, and the 2IC of the patrol would go down and draw the rations out of the Q store based on 5 men, 6 men for the length of time you're out. So he'd work it out by meals. And you draw ration packs. If it was, like I said, wet season, you draw dehydrated stuff. Dry season, you use Australian canned stuff, and some American. And American stuff was good because it had cigarettes in the ration packs, little packets of 5 Winstons and stuff like that. And we all smoked in those days. Well, most of us did anyway. And the 2IC would bring it all down the lines and lay it all out, and blokes would draw their rations. If there's any special gear, you'd sign for it. The SIG, as a Sigma, I'd go up to the ComSen, draw the radio, which would be fully serviced and ready to go. Get my codes, get my net sheet, whatever other instructions they'd give me. Take it down the lines, do a radio check with the communication centre just by throwing a wire on the ground. Do all that stuff. Draw the other radios, whether you needed a VHF radio to talk to the chopper, or a UHF radio to talk to the chopper. At one stage early in our tour, we had a balloon, a huge balloon, like a barrage balloon, up on a cable, about 700 feet cable. They used to wind it up every day and with a radio on top of it, trying to get VHF comms. Don't forget, the province was only 40 k's from coast to mountains, and from Delta to the other border of Fuktui. Bintui. So 40 square k's. That's how big the province was, and it wasn't much at all. So you could get communications anywhere in the province by using HF, using a ground wire or a small wire. Not a quarter wavelength dipole would fire the signal right over the top. But with a small aerial, you could get a fairly weak signal through, and that's all we ever concentrated on. And the 2IC would issue all the stuff. We'd have briefings, we'd talk about ambushing, we'd talk about the patrol commander would work his way through his plan, what he's going to do. And our maps were picto maps. We had picto map is a photograph, an air photo that's been gridded. So you actually got a map on a photo. So when you're flying along in the chopper, you can actually see the landing zone. There it is there, or the river, actually had bomb damage holes all the way across one of the maps. Where the B-52s had flown all the way from Guam, just dropped their bombs and flew back again. I don't know what the hell they dropped them there for, but anyway.
Random bombing.
Vietnam was bombing in Vietnam was just out of order. They dropped more bombs in Vietnam than they did in the whole of World War II. It's just ridiculous. See, one of those B-52s could carry the equivalent of about 20 super fortresses. It's just enormous. Anyway, the patrol will be ready. You get briefed by the intelligence people that come down and brief you about the area. They'll give you an area brief about the units that have been seen in the area and previous patrol reports, and we'd study all that. So everyone would be full bottle on the area when you went in. And I was the SIG in the patrol, so a 6-man patrol. Clem Dwyer, one of my favourite patrol commanders, always had a 6-man patrol because he liked to be able to move people around in units, like 2s or 2 pairs of 3s or 3 2s, or Whereas 5-man, you just couldn't carry enough gear and it got a bit unwieldy. 4-man, which was the SAS staple from Borneo, was just too unwieldy. I went on a couple of 4-man patrols. That was a hairy little thing. You didn't have enough firepower there or enough gear to do the job. Not bad in the wet season. 4-man patrol in the wet season, sure, but you haven't got to carry any water. You just catch it every day in your poncho. 5 o'clock every day. And that's the difference between the dry and the wet.
You mentioned creeping something.
Creeping mank.
Yes.
It's just a skin rash that we used to get in the bush from being wet all the time. It was just one of those torturous things like prickly heat. And used to get prickly heat too. But not taking your boots off for 12 to 14 days, your feet are totally wet all the time, that they get all shriveled up and you get manky and you get all sorts of infestations of tin ear and God knows what else. So the patrol really couldn't go for any longer than that, on the grounds of body maintenance. And your crutch was the same, you can imagine. Never take your clothes off for 14 days. And you used to stink like a polecat.
But you wouldn't be able to smell each other though.
No, not really. And the VC couldn't smell either. They smelt worse than us. So they never took their clothes off, sort of thing. But that was just the way it was.
So would it take very long for things like creeping mank to clear up?
Yeah, it did. Patrols would normally get about a week in between patrols, 2 weeks maybe, depending on the need for information by the task force, depending on, a bit like a rugby team, you can only run as many blokes on the field as you've got up to it, and some blokes had prickly heat rashes, other guys would go on R&R, other guys would be sick from other stuff, other guys would be away on secondment or attachment to other units. So picking a patrol, and blokes always tried to stay in the same patrols. You didn't want to chop and change all the time, because you then had to relearn everybody else's tactics. Every patrol was different, totally. For instance, our patrol used to face in the LUPs. LUPs are lying up places, where 90% of patrol commanders face out in LUPs, so we faced in.
Why did you do that?
Well, on long patrols, it was always easier to keep concentration by looking at each other and watching over each other's back. Your arc of responsibility was directly behind the guy in front of you. And you're basically sitting in a circle with your feet nearly touching in the middle, in thick bush. So it was a lot easier to stay on the ball. If you were facing the other way and at about 3 or 4 metres, guys used to go to sleep and you have to throw rocks at them to wake them up or to tell them anything. Or this way you could spread a map out in the middle and have all sorts of briefings. And just to each his own. I always faced in my patrols later on when I was a patrol commander. Clem Dwyer was a great advocate of facing in. The blokes in Borneo used to face in patrols, and I've always thought it was a better way to do it.
How about the general signals that you could use out there?
Hand signals? Oh, there's all sorts of signals, Recce. Enemy was the big one. enemy. Smell, sound, patrol commander, or just point to where the rank is normally when you're wearing rank. Comms, LUP or that, depending on. But everyone knew signals. There was no real dramas. Stop, listen, direction of move, LUP, foot track being used, running water. Even though one of our guys went up on American recondo course in the north of South Vietnam, and he was the scout, and he indicated to the Americans one of these. And everyone thought he was indicating running water, so they all drank their remaining water. And about 300 metres later, they were all saying, "Where's the water?" And he said, "No, I was indicating snake." You know.
Well, that's what I would think. That is snake.
We never used that in our patrol. You know, we had other signals. Every patrol had different signals, but they were generally you could be generally the same, but slight differences. Some blokes went like that for LUPs, other blokes went like that for LUPs. You know, propping on the ground. Other guys went like that for a 5-minute smoke. Other guys went like that for a stop. You know, just depended on who you were with. Most of us only ever worked with about max 3 different patrol commanders in 12 months, so you were pretty well used to them. You know, you tried to stay in the same patrol, especially if it was a good patrol. Bad patrols, you couldn't wait to get out of them.
Could you actually excuse yourself from a particular group of people that you didn't get along with?
No. You went and saw your boss and said, "Look, I'd like to go to another patrol if there's a vacancy." They'd try and accommodate you sometimes, but it happened to me. I spent 5 months in one patrol. I went to my boss and said, "I can't handle any more of this." So I went to another patrol.
What was the problem with that particular patrol?
He was basically the officer who really never knew much more than I did, and he was wheeling us around the bush. We got into more strife than 10 people. We had a lot of contacts with the enemy, and some of them were just they weren't contacts we should have had, you know.
So unnecessary.
I think a lot of it, we blundered around the bush a fair bit with this bloke. He really didn't know what he was doing any more than I did. I was only 21, he was probably a year older, you know. But I couldn't stand it any longer. My nerves were on edge. I never enjoyed going out the bush with this bloke. And when I left his patrol and went to another patrol, it was fantastic. It was like a new lease of life. Felt safe. The whole bush experience was far better, you know.
Well, maybe if we could just rewind just a little bit. I don't think we've asked you about the first patrol that you went out on.
The first patrol? First patrol was a shakedown patrol. By shakedown I mean just getting acclimatised and used to the bush and different scenarios and things. It was a 4-day patrol, and we went in on last light by helicopter into a landing zone. Raced off into the bush and propped for the night. Heard nothing. Moved off next day and basically wandered around a 6 to 8 grid square AO, area of operations. Just wandered around it like that. Listening for shots coming across tracks and footpads, checking them out, finding nothing. It was designed for that. It didn't want to send people into areas of known enemy action on their first patrol. The patrol commanders had already been out on one patrol with the previous squadron as a handover, and it was just a matter of getting your feet under the desk, basically. One of the patrols got in a big fight, a big shoot-up.
That was like their first
very
patrol?
First patrol.
Gee, what happened?
Well, it was pretty untidy. They lost no one killed or wounded, but it wasn't very much fun for some of those guys. The previous squadron, 2 Squadron, their very first patrol in one instance was the big tractor job where they blew a tractor up. And I don't know whether you've heard about that, but Frank Cashmore led a patrol in and blew up a tractor and trailer full of enemy, killed about 18 or 20, and destroyed a tractor and a big trailer of rice. That was their first patrol. So they did very well. That galvanised that squadron into gear, though. They really hit their straps after that. That squadron saw a lot of action. Probably a lot more action than us. We saw a lot of action, but I think 2 Squadron, they were there when the Tet Offensive was happening in September, October 1968. And the Tet Offensive was where the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese made the big push on Saigon, and came within that much of succeeding. So the place was awash with enemy during their tour. There was quite a lot of enemy during our tour, but the tour after us, 1 Squadron, they'd faded away again. There was hardly anybody there. It's just the luck of the draw, you know.
So what was the first situation that you came across where you had some contact?
Crossing a track, getting a signal saying enemy, everyone props. Just crouching in the bush, watching 6 or 8 enemy walk past from here to there. It's quite hard, you know. We used to call it 5 cent, 10 cent. That's what the little bum was doing. But you're really crapping yourself. And you generally are until the shooting starts. And then everything's calm. It's funny. It's a funny thing. The adrenaline hurts so much, you can feel it into your fingers and your toes, and and your brain is in shock. But once the shooting starts, it's generally pretty good.
Do you think that's because of some sort of a release?
Yeah, I think so. And the training kicks in, and you don't do too badly. But to see the enemy the first time in black pyjamas was a bit scary, and we saw him a lot after that. We saw him a lot on tracks, off tracks, in camps, in creek lines, all over the place. And we sometimes had contacts and sometimes we didn't. So depending on whether it was a recce patrol or a fighting patrol. Recce patrol, you just tried to stay sort of undiscovered. But we've got a couple of recce patrols where we had to get ripped out through the trees on a hot extraction. I got the aerial out. It's documented in the book.
Perhaps you could tell us.
Phantoms of the Jungle, yeah, by David Horner. And we were on a recce patrol, and the forward scout basically bumped into 2 Viet Cong carrying a pig on a stick and shot him, and quite stupidly. And that was it. We were off. We were racing. We always pull back through each other and go, because you've got to run, otherwise you die. And before we knew it, we had a 30, 50 VC chasing us. But they were on tracks and we weren't. We were going down this hill into this creek line full of wait a while and rose type bushes and things. Very
so
quickly.
Getting ripped.
Yeah. Got in the creek line and they were throwing grenades and firing RPGs, and we're trying to get up the other side, and I got caught in all these vines and I couldn't get through, and the patrol commander came back and pulled me through. He saved my life basically. Ripped me through, and we ran to the top of this hill, around this hill, and it was one of those exhausting things where you had nothing left. And anyway, we basically evaded them, we thought. And we finally got to a spot where we could lay our aerial, and I put the aerial out and called in the choppers to pull us out. And they sent it in a light fire team. A light fire team is 2 helicopter gunships. And they come in and blast the place up. So we threw smoke, indicating where we were, red smoke. The smoke's drifting up through the trees, and we're sitting in the smoke, and the gunships are brassing up each side of us. It's quite scary, and all the expended shells are falling on our heads and God knows what. And next minute, the slick ship, the pickup chopper, is there, and he's dropped ropes down through the trees, and we've hooked on. We carry a rope called a linen star Swiss seat, and you put it on, wrap it around you. The carabiner at the front, They drop the ropes through the trees and with a lead weight on it, and you hook onto the loop, and they just drag you out through the trees and away, and carry you a couple of 1,000 feet above the ground. It's called a hot extraction. But without that, you wouldn't have got out. We lost one bloke missing in action doing the same thing in that tour. He fell off the rope.
Gee.
Yeah, Dave Fisher. He's still missing in action, presumed killed, of course.
Doesn't it, like when you're throwing smoke and you've got the gunships coming along, doesn't that make you a sitting duck for a...
Oh, it does, but it also empowers you a bit. You know, Charlie's there firing all sorts of stuff, but he's got to keep his head down too, otherwise they fire rockets and miniguns into the bush, and one pass can cover a lot of ground. You're sitting ducks when you're dragged up through the trees too, you're expecting to get one up the arse any moment, and doesn't happen, and you suddenly realise you're still alive, you know. And you're getting dragged through, and you've put your Swiss seat on wrong, and one of your testicles is on one side of the rope and the other, and you're just in agony, and you're trying to say to the door gunner, let us down, let us down. So they drop you down on the Firestone Trail or something and land beside you, pick up all the ropes, chuck them in and fly back to the DAT. They dragged a Kiwi patrol back one day all the way back to Nui Dat, and he miscalculated the approach into the pad. There's a band of barbed wire around the hill about 20 feet below the crest of the hill. He dragged them in, and the whole patrol got dragged through the barbed wire. Wasn't very good. So yeah, it's either that or you die, you know. And we used hot extractions quite a lot. And
you're all hanging off the bottom of the helicopter?
We're all hanging off individual ropes, each man. It's a 6-man patrol. They bring out 6 ropes, and they've got an RAD inside the aeroplane. It's a device where all the ropes are hooked into a bar that goes along the middle, controlled by the crewies and all that sort of stuff, and they just throw the ropes down, big lead weight, and you hook onto it and away you go. And it's quite scary, especially when Charlie's running everywhere shooting, you know. But we never lost anybody shot like that. We lost one bloke fell off the rope in between 200 and 800 feet, supposedly. Well, he could have been anywhere. Whether he fell into a bomb crater or whether he fell into jungle, they never found him. They sent a lot of people in looking for him. No sign.
With, you mentioned before the aerial that you laid it out. What do you mean lay it out? Is it on the ground or is it up in the air?
On the ground wire. You just threaded it through the bush. If your camp was that way, the aerial had to be 90 degrees to the camp. So
why is that?
So the radiation from the aerial will go towards the camp. If you point the aerial at the camp, the only radiation that's going to go is it coming at the end. You know what I mean?
Not really.
It's a whole day on antenna theory.
Okay. So you've got to...
Ask one of those SIGs.
Right.
Ask Craig Bramley or somebody, they'll explain it.
Does it take a reasonable amount of time to do this?
No, you take your aerial out, you get your compass out, work out where camp is. The camp's there, the aerial's got to go out there. So someone covers you, and you take it out in your teeth sort of thing and thread it through the bush in a straight line, and that's it. One wire, about 25 metres long, and it's called a ground wire, and that was enough because it's HF. Anything bigger would bounce the signal straight over the top of the receiving station, which was only 15 to 20 k's away, you know. So the smaller the wire, the less chance of the signal bouncing over the top. So you're still getting skywave, but it was a weak skywave, and sometimes you're only getting... There are 5 levels of communication signal strength: 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. 1, you can barely hear it, needless to say. 5 is loud and clear. So you can imagine your signal strength with a ground wire put out very quickly like that would be about 2s and 3s. And that was the beauty of the signals back in the ComSend, is they could read it, they could hear it, and they'd reactivate or activate the choppers to get out there and get you fairly quick smart. Based on your signal would be a code word saying contact, require hot extraction, like cat, rat, mat, just in clear. And they would have that in front of them, and they activate the choppers. The choppers are sitting on the pad down there with the crews in the waiting room, a bit like the Battle of Britain crews. You know, you see them rush out to their their Spitfires will be like that. Or if they know you're in contact, they've already activated them and they're waiting to be called in, and they'll be standing off to the side with a light fire team of two gunships. Heavy fire team, which I never had the pleasure of using, which was 3 or more gunships, and that's a lot of firepower. Ironically, they've just retired the gunships this month.
Really?
From the Defence Force, yeah. They were great. Called Bush Rangers. That was their call sign, Bush Ranger.
How often would the 4 be used?
I never saw it used in an SAS patrol. But I suppose the battalions in big shoot-ups would have needed a heavy fire team. They just didn't have enough to go around. I think they had 5 or 6 gunships altogether, and that was it. If there were 3 or 4 patrols deployed, theoretically, there could be 3 or 4 different patrols in contact with the enemy at any one time. So the resources get spread fairly thinly on the deck. One of our big shoot-up patrols, there was another patrol across the border in Bin Tui province, and he had a lot further to go to rearm and refuel than us. So we're in contact, they're in contact, so they went to them first. But they used all their ammo on that patrol, and had to fly all the way back to Nui Dat to rearm and refuel before they could come to us. It was quite scary. You're calling for extraction, and they said just wait.
How long would it usually take before you called and it would come?
Well, it depends on where you were in the province, but sometimes you could actually hear the choppers take off from Nui Dat. But generally, if they've got the choppers on the ground and the communications centre is in direct contact with the operations centre down in the headquarters, they could activate the choppers within 5 minutes of getting your signal and be out with you within 20 minutes, 15 minutes. That's pretty good.
It's got to be a pretty tense time then, sitting
Oh,
around
yeah, it's
waiting.
always very tense. The battalions had the firepower to stand and fight. We didn't have the firepower. 4 to 6 man patrol can't carry enough firepower to convince anybody that anything more than the 4 to 6 man patrol. That's why some of the guys cut the big flash hider off the barrels of their rifles and made them into a weapon called the bitch. The bitch was an automatic SLR that was built by one of the armourers, and it used to sound like a 50 calibre machine gun. Used to fire very slowly. It was all automatic, and to go boom, 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 but it used to shoot flames out this. And it was great because the enemy used to think they'd hit a heavy weapons company or something not an SAS patrol, which would give you a bit of breathing space. Without that, they'd be right up your clacker, you know. And we did a fair bit of time running through the bush, live to fight another day and all that sort of stuff. So that was the nature of our work in Vietnam.
Did you ever have any close calls where you thought that you weren't going to survive?
Oh yeah, numerous times. That one caught up in the vines, I thought we were all gone there. Another one with Clem towards the end of the trip. We had a couple of reinforcements in the patrol. We had a 6-man patrol. 2 very good soldiers, Vladislav Kazmarek and Barry Lansdowne had just joined the patrol. And we'd swanned around for a couple of days and we had seen nothing. We thought, this is great, this is the last patrol. We were going home this was on a Wednesday night, Wednesday afternoon. We were leaving the country on Friday. We were still out in the bush on the Wednesday. We're sitting in the bush eating spaghetti and meatball dehydrated rations, and you can imagine what they smelt like over a little cooker. Beautiful. And we hear this digging and banging on the ground, and we got to a position where we could use some binoculars, and out on the landing zone, the fairly big landing zone, there were Viet Cong and women digging yams and things. So they were doing it pretty hard. But they must have smelled our food. Must have smelt it. Anyway, they faded off into the J, and we never heard any more about them for about half an hour. And then we're all facing in. We're only about 50 metres into the jungle from the edge of the landing zone. And the bloke sitting on this side looked and he saw a line of about 10 Viet Cong coming through the bush, rifles up like this. They knew where we were and they were coming to knock us over. So I climbed a wire in his inimitable style, quickly briefed everybody, right, this is what's going to happen. You lead out in the middle of the landing zone. I'll stop them. Clem had a big automatic SLR with 30 round magazines and a couple of grenades, and he stood behind a tree and we went, and he got stuck in it with the SLR, fired a 20 round burst and threw a couple of grenades, and that meantime we bolted out in the middle of this huge landing zone, about big as about 4 football fields, I suppose. And there was a clump of bushes and a sort of hill, a mound. We basically went to ground there. And then Clem came running out of the bush, and there was an RPD, a Russian light machine gun called an RPD, opened up on one of the flanks, and there's dirt flying up all over the place around him as he's running. And he fell down. I thought, oh no, he's gone. We're finished here. Anyway, he got up and started running again. He was right. I got comms there too. I put out an aerial and got comms, and we thought no more about it. We were fighting, but there were people. There was a lot of fire coming from where we'd been, and a lot of fire coming from the left flank. We were worried about the other side. We didn't have enough guys to cover everything. Anyway, we got a word. We're on the UHF radio at this stage, the UX-10, and we got the word, throw smoke now. So we had these little tiny smoke poppers. So you screw the top off and you strike it like a match and throw it. And it burns very, very fiercely, and just red smoke, green smoke, whatever, and red smoke. And we were still shooting away, just suppressing the bush. And a bushfire started, a grass fire, really on, but the wind was blowing the other way, thank God. But before we knew it, there was a helicopter landing in the middle of the smoke, right behind us. Unbelievable, 20 metres away. He just brought us straight in and landed. And we couldn't believe it, our luck, so we just dived on board and he away and pulled us out. Brilliant bit of work. I think Squadron Leader Crimmins, I think he was flying it. He won a Distinguished Flying Cross. I'm not sure whether it was to that one, but would have been one of them. But they'd run out of gunships, and we were up about 3,000 feet, and all of a sudden there's these dive bombers, American dive bombers, dropping bombs smack where we were eating our food about half an hour before.
Gee.
God almighty. OV-10 Broncos they were. They called them up from Saigon. They had no gunships left at Navidad. They called the US Air Force in from Saigon, and there they were on the job. Very scary.
They ran out of gunships because
other patrols, yeah. Other patrols, other tasks, rearming, refueling. You're just not enough. We were very strapped with gear. The Americans had unlimited resources. We just didn't. And that's just the way it was.
Would the pilots and the gunships be Australian, or would they?
They're Australians. Yeah. The first initial gunships, the gunships that were used by our first 2 squadrons up there, 3 squadron, then 1 squadron, first 3 squadrons, 3, 1 and 2, were American gunships, and they were there when we first arrived too, but our own gunships had just been built. They were UH-1Ds with miniguns and door guns and God knows what, and they became the Bush Rangers 01, 02, 03 and 04. I think we only had 4 of them. But whenever they were short of gunships and they needed heavy fire teams and stuff, they'd call on the Americans. The Americans would come in the Snake Eyes or the Rattlesnakes or whatever call signs they had at the time. They'd come in and be armed to the teeth and give you fire support and then fly away again, you know. But it was always good to have our gunships around. We trusted them. The Americans would come and do a pass over the top, but way off target and be quite ineffective. But our blokes used to come in very close, as close as possible.
So do you think they were better pilots, the Australians?
I think so. I think our pilots, well, not better pilots, just a little bit more into what their job was, you know. The Yanks used to, supporting Australians, no war going on down here, you know. But I never got to. I saw one American gunship in the whole time. The rest was Australians, I think. Yeah, so we got pulled out back to the DAT, and contact patrols were. You were met on the pad at Nui Dat. The pad was called Nadzab after the big parachute drop zone during World War II up in New Guinea, where the Americans and the Australian artillery jumped into. It was called Nadzab. So we named our helicopter pad up at Nui Dat Nadzab. And they meet you on Nadzab with a carton of beer or a bottle of champagne, or depending on how bad it was. You'd be people clapping each other on the back, and you'd clear your weapons into the test fire pit and go down and rip all your manky clothes off. And then you'd have to have a scrub up, have a feed, have a debrief, and then you can get on the grog. Each patrol had a carton of beer or a couple of cartons of beer. But you were then entitled to 36 hours down in Vung Tau, rest and convalescence, R&C. So you'd jump on the truck or a chopper next day and head off down to Vungus for a couple of days of mayhem, which was always good. We did quite a few of those, quite a few, on the grounds that you'd had quite a few contacts. If you didn't have a contact, you just came back and unloaded your gear and got ready for, we issued a warning order again in a couple of days.
So do you actually want to have a contact or not?
Well, no, yeah.
Because you get a holiday.
You do, but I suppose boys used to say they were full of piss and bad manners, but it's not arrogance, it's just confidence. The blokes, a lot of patrols were very confident and very gung-ho, wanted to take the fight up to the enemy all the time, and those guys, sure, yeah, let's bugger going out in the bush and not seeing anything, we'd rather see something. And they'd get a big shoot up, or they'd capture a lot of documents or weapons or a prisoner or whatever the job was, and they'd be pretty cock-a-hoop, So going there to Vung Tau with your mates was always a fun thing, because Vung Tau was just the local Captain Jacques, the French resort down on the coast. It didn't look much like a French resort when we were there. She was a bit of a cesspit, but you could see that it used to be nice once upon a time.
How many people were living there at the time?
In Vung Tau?
Yeah.
Oh, it was a medium-sized city. It was a sort of Bunbury-sized city.
Oh, that's pretty large.
Yeah, there'd be hundreds of thousands of them. Vietnam's very well populated. Saigon was a pretty big city. That wasn't very far away, actually. It was only about 40 miles away from Vung Tau.
Did you have any favourite places in Vung Tau?
Oh, no, well, they were all knock shops and God knows what else. And the 36 bar, or 37 bar, was a barber shop, but you couldn't get a haircut there. The Grand Hotel, the battalions used to go to the Grand Hotel. Well, we never went there very much. The Tokyo bar, there were quite a lot of bars that blokes used to wander around in, but the place was just full of Americans and full of Americans and Australians with money. And the MPs used to wander around in a Jeep, an American, a Kiwi, and an Aussie MPs, there to knock anyone over the head that they needed to quieten down, sort of thing, But in the main, you just drank, and you bought Saigon tea for the girls. Saigon tea was $5 a glass or something. It was only cream de menthe cordial, but it meant they sat with you and talked to you, and a bit of the other if they were into that. But it was just a bit of fun. And then the Badco Club was on the base, the Australian Air Force Base, or one AOSG, one Australian Logistic Support Base, support group. They built a club called the Badco Club after Peter Badco, the Victoria Cross winner. He was killed in action up there. And the Badco Club had a big swimming pool, had accommodation, it had a good boozer, good big size canteen thing with balconies and everything. That's all gone now, of course. But it was a good spot to be. The scariest thing that ever happened to me in Vietnam was laying in one of the accommodation rooms at the Badco Club, right on the beach at Vung Tau. and being woken about 3 o'clock in the morning by the ground moving, rumbling, and everyone fell out of bed and outside, and we worked out that it was an arc-light mission, a B-52 strike on the Long High Mountains about 10 mile away. It was shaking the ground.
Gee.
And the planes were dropping for about 30,000 feet. But the noise and the rumbling was just unbelievable. These huge bombs slamming into this mountain. There would have been a lot of VC killed there. Yeah. No, that was Bugtower, yeah. But you kept away from the place fairly well. They had a sign on one of the, outside the payoffs there, all weapons are to be cleared into this drum. They had a 44-gallon drum buried in the ground full of sand. And to clear a weapon, you're supposed to take the magazine off, cock it, remove the round, let it go forward, safety catch off, fire the action, safety catch on, and put your mag back on. So it's rendered safe. One of the guys in one of the other squadrons saw this sign and thought, so he fired a 20-round burst into the drum outside the pay office. Needless to say, the poor old pogos, as they're called pogos down in Bugtower, were running a mile. You know, they weren't used to that sort of stuff. I think he was donged pretty heavily over that.
Scaring pogos.
Poor old pogs.
How did the Americans view the SAS?
The only people we had anything to do with were the American Special Forces and one of the other squadrons, the SEAL teams down in the Delta. We weren't very pleased with the American Special Forces. They came to Nui Dat, or Phúc Tui province, once to do some training with us and then conduct a patrol in our province. And they were there for a week. We didn't have much to do with them in their build-up. They camped separately to us. They ate separately. They were briefed separately, and they had a specific job to do. They went out in the bush for about 5 days, and at the end of the patrol, the Viet Cong caught them on their in their last LUP and killed 2 and wounded 3. Sitting there with their thumb up their bums, not paying attention, and they got caught. So we weren't very happy. We never lost anybody at this stage. Certainly not in the dangerous place of an extraction landing zone. You know, that's a seriously dangerous place to be switched off. That's where you had to really be on the pill. So we weren't very happy with the US Special Forces, but some of our blokes went up to Quang Tri and a few other places, Da Nang and Nha Trang, wherever the Special Forces groups were working, and did recondo courses with them and topped the courses. You know, we showed the Americans how to do the job, basically. But Westmoreland, General Westmoreland, started off his LRPs, his long-range reconnaissance patrols. After having seen the SAS at work, he wanted patrols that worked like SAS. And but we just didn't have much else to do with them. We know the Americans were quite impressed with the way we conducted ourselves. Basically, our body count. We didn't lose anybody. One bloke shot accidentally, and one bloke missing in action from a chopper. It's not a bad record for the whole time in Vietnam. The other guys, we shot two guys ourselves accidentally. Not our squadron, another squadron. And one bloke blew himself up with a grenade accidentally. But all in all, we lost nobody. We had control. And that was the big difference. We had control of our province. The Charlie just decided to go elsewhere after they had their nose bloodied by the Australians every time they went to the bush. The VC decided, bugger this, we'll leave them out. The Australians had control of that province, and we knew it, and they knew it. And Long Tam was a very bloody nose. Then 68 with the Tet Offensive, there was a lot going on there. They got a very bloody nose again. And every time our patrols hit them, they hit them big time. And I think the body count was over 550 Viet Cong to only one of ours. So not bad ratio. From a soldier's point of view, we felt good being in command because we did what they did. We melted into the bush. We never used shaving cream or we smoked, but only because they did. They smoked Cool cigarettes, you know, the Cool?
Yeah.
Menthol. They were heavily into menthol cigarettes. We never listened to radios in the bush. We never did. We never switched off. We never took our gear off. Even if you want to go to the toilet, number 2s or something, you'd still have your webbing on, and you just have it hanging from your shoulders, and your rifle in your hand. And there's a couple of instances where guys have actually fired while they've been out having a crap, and dropped a couple of enemy. Needless to say, they were ribbed for the rest of their life about, you know, and never finished up, sort of thing. But it was a classic case of knowing your enemy and knowing how to operate in the field. We really knew how to operate in that province. If we had been in big mountains or down in the Delta, it would have been a different kettle of fish, of course. And there are many commentators over the years and some ex-commanding officers of SAS who were on the record as saying that we were used incorrectly in Vietnam. Well, I don't think we were. I think we were used correctly for the time that we were given. There's no point in sending SAS up to the militarised zone in northern part of South Vietnam just to prove we can get killed as easy as Americans. You know, what's the point of that? The American Special Forces used to build aid camps, a big camp on top of a hill, denude the hill and build this fortification, exactly like the French used to do in 1953. And we all know what happened to the French. The French got their ass kicked big time at Dien Bien Phu. Americans didn't learn anything from the French experience, and I'd like to think we did. You know.
And you guys sure you weren't smoking dope?
No, there was dope there, up on the hill. There was a bloody signal squadron troop up there, 110 signal squadron, who a couple of idiots amongst them had dope, and a couple of blokes, not in our, well, one bloke in our squadron, and a couple of blokes in a subsequent squadron used to get dope off them, but it was only marijuana. It was nothing. I never ever saw anybody smoking dope. Certainly no hard stuff. But the Americans and their heroin, that was all a concerted plan by the Viet Cong. Inserted tons of heroin into Vietnam to be given away to American servicemen. And it's the perfect way to undermine a war effort, is to make the soldiers incapable of fighting. And all the American troops went for it like hell. You know, all of a sudden you had all this heroin fighting, a very high grade heroin fighting around for very little. A lot of people made a lot of money out of it, and a lot of people became drug addicts and worse. You know, so it was a terrible shame. But that was a Viet Cong ploy. That was part of their game.
Did you see Americans under the influence of those drugs
No.
when you were on?
No, we didn't see the Americans. We lived in a sort of enclave.
You didn't see them in Bungtao?
Yeah, you did, but they were just drunk, you know. You could tell them who's drunk or who's on a bit of, you know, who's been smoking weed. You could smell it sometime in bars and things, but it wasn't that big a problem. Not around our people. I went on R&R to Hong Kong, and I know that there were 6 huge American black guys pulled up by the little Hong Kong police and given a real once-over. They stripped them right down, the whole bit. Cavity searches, the lot, because they were convinced they were bringing drugs into the country. I saw all those guys later, so they obviously never got done. And I saw them later because they all bought iridescent suits off the tailors, green and orange iridescent suits, and they're trucking around Hong Kong. You know, these big 6'10", huge they were. These orange suits, I couldn't believe it. But no, we didn't have much to do with the Yanks at all. I must have spoken to 3 Americans in 12 months in Vietnam. It's just the way it was. Don't forget, I was a fairly lowly digger. I was only a baggy ass who didn't know much about much, and we kept our head down fairly well and just concentrated on what we were doing. Now, a lot of our officers and a lot of the guys that went on secondments to the American units would have had a lot more to do with the Americans than I did. I know the boys were pretty impressed with the SEALs down in the Delta, Don Tam and those places. I went out on operations with the SEALs and saw quite a lot of action, and they were pretty impressed with them. But apart from that, no, I hadn't much experience at all.
Just getting back to the boozer back at the DAT, you guys were drinking sort of half a carton a day. How out of control did you get?
Everyone was a bit pissy at the end of the night. No two ways about that.
Any sort of antics you recall? Funny incidents?
No, I drink it in the movie theatre and having just drinking on. Someone had more grog or something, so we were up there at midnight drinking, and the duty officer's coming down the road with a big torch. So we've run off into the bush like schoolgirls, and I've dived into this big pile of bush I thought was a beautiful, comfortable piece of bush. And all it was a triple concertina of barbed wire covered in vines. So I was hung up in these damn things, cut to ribbons, absolutely chewed up. But anyway, the duty officer came and couldn't find us, and the boys extracted me after about half an hour and took me up to the RAP where Kev Logan was woken up and said, "Hey Kev, get the mercurochrome out," you know. And my back was cut to ribbons. I haven't got a scar to this day, you know. But oh God, but no way in the world I would have done that if I hadn't been drunk. But you were benign drunk, you know. There were a couple of blokes who had been out of order who tried to do stupid things on the grog.
What kind
Go
of
on
things?
getting their guns and stuff. You know, but you got to remember, we're in an armed camp. Everyone's armed to the teeth.
Were there many of those incidents?
No, not really. Not in our squadron. The lid was kept on it a bit. I must admit, someone said one day, this squadron's going to explode. And there was a real problem between ranks. The diggers seeing themselves as being treated less than they should have been treated by some people. Some people would get guns, and nothing like down at one of the battalions, 9 Battalion, where a digger dropped a grenade onto a bloke's bed when he was sleeping and blew him to bits, you know. And another guy down at the service corps mob walked into the sergeant's mess and just opened up at the guy standing against the bar and shot about 6 of them, killed 1 and shot 5. Then ran back to his hoochie and blew the cordite out of the barrel and put his rifle back in the rack and jumped into bed and pulled the sheets over his head. Like, hello. And there's none of that went on in our squadron. I think our blokes are a little bit more disciplined than that, but I think there were a couple of times where things could have gone right off the rails. Just that close. And some of our leaders need to look back and think, hang on, if I'd have done that a bit differently, it mightn't have been as dramatic as it was, but there were close calls. There were a couple of close instances. So I won't mention really what they were, but there were a couple of times where people were actually going to blow people up. People were actually going to shoot people, but talked out of it, that sort of stuff. But
Is that while you're in the bush or while you're at the DAT?
Oh, in the bush and at the DAT. Those sort of things happened. They shouldn't have happened, but and they only happened because of incompetence of people. Yeah, there are a couple of instances that I don't want to really talk about.
I might just pause for a minute. So eventually the booze was restricted to 2 cans,
2 cans a day,
perhaps.
Per day, perhaps, exactly. It didn't make much sense. The order came from the brigadier down the bottom. Everything was under control up in our lines. There didn't need to be this heavy-handed crap, this Nazi sort of imposition of rules. You know, we were doing the job. We were stacking them up like cordwood. You know, what else do they want us to do? You know, we needed some release. We needed to come back to the DAT and have a good drink. You know. But some of the other squadrons had a worse time with us, with that sort of stuff than we did. We smuggled grog in. A chopper would land on Anzac and the boys would scurry off into the bush with half a dozen cartons of courage, which was another awful drink that was sent up from Australia. By the time the 2IC got to the chopper pad, the chopper was taking off and there was no sign of anybody. What's going on? Why were they here? Yeah, it just happened, you know. You get around it. There's one thing I will admit, and it doesn't have to be off the record, is that we relieved the beer supply company down at the DAT, down at headquarters, of a whole pallet of VB one day. Went down with a truck, we paid for a pallet, and the bloke said, "Oh, quick! I'm very busy, you blokes. Can you blokes drive that fork?" And one bloke said, "Yeah, we can drive the fork." So we put 2 pallets on the truck and drove off. We drank free grog for about 2 weeks.
As you would.
As you would. And there's no questions asked, no nothing. We had a pallet of grog for nothing. This dozy pest down there shouldn't have allowed us to drive his forklift. Anyway, so what it was you tried anything you could to get tin, corrugated iron, timber. You basically pinched it off to the engineers, or you got it off someone else, or you traded it for cartons of beer, or you traded. We had one of our Q-store blokes used to trade menthol cigarettes for poncho liners. The Vietnamese used to make these camouflage poncho liners, which are a nice soft blanket to wrap yourself in. Everyone had poncho liners. They're the liners you pin inside one of those big American Sentry ponchos when it's cold. Anyway, the Vietnamese used to swap these things for cartons of beer, cartons of cigarettes. So it was all black market. And but one day the black market got caught. They were waiting for him at the gate, and he used to carry all the stuff on a truck underneath all the laundry. The laundry would go to the laundry down in Berea, and the whole bottom underneath the laundry was covered in cartons of cigarettes, like bricks, you know. And there were hundreds of cartons going to Berea to trade for poncho liners, and he got caught.
Red-handed.
So we lost all our cartons of cigarettes. Everyone in the squadron, I think, would have been involved in that. I don't know what happened to him over it, whether he got kicked up the arse or whether he got away with it. But that was the only way he could get these poncho liners, trade them with the locals. And it was absolutely against the laws, of course.
Why?
Well, it was black market. The MPs hated that sort of thing.
But these poncho liners sound almost like a necessity.
Well, yeah, but you never needed them in the DAT. It was never. Well, I suppose in the winter, the wet season. Yeah, I think the winter was the wet season. It got cold at night, but you had a sheet. I used to get sheets from the Q store. I never ever used anything more than a sheet. It was so hot up there, bloody middle of the tropics. But poncho liners were pretty tradable commodity. You know, they were pretty cool bit of kit, and everyone had them. The only way you could get them was to trade cigarettes.
Just getting back to relationships at the DAT, what was the relationship like between combatants and non-combatants?
Well, we always worked on the principle that our whole squadron was there to fight the battle, and we couldn't do our job without their job being done. But I must admit, I was very, very angry with our Q store once when I got dragged through the bush and all my clothes ripped off me. I took my cams down to the Q store to trade them in for new ones, swapped them one for one, and the quartermaster sergeant reached around behind him and grabbed a housewife. You know what a housewife is?
Was it a knife?
It's a roll of sewing gear. The soldiers have always been issued since day one. It's actually pronounced a hussif, but it's housewife. Grabbed a housewife off the shelf and threw it at me and said, "Go and sew them up." Well, we planned to burn that Q store down for about 3 weeks after that. We were going to burn everything down. Everyone was a bit crazy towards the end of the tour. We're going to kill the cooks. We're going to do all sorts of things. But, you know, young lunatics. But the worst thing about that is that the people at the leadership level in our squadron were unaware it was going on. And they should have been aware, should have been across it far more. They segregated the diggers out by having a sergeant's oblique officer's mess, and none of us were allowed even near that place. And we had our own boozer, and if you weren't out the bush, you were treated like dogs, you know, and the lid was going to blow off it one day. Sorry about that.
It's all right.
But that's just the way it was. But at the end of the tour, we got through it.
Well, it's just appalling that you'd come back from the bush and you'd get no cooperation from the...
Yeah, not as bad as one of the squadrons later on who went to Malaya after spending 3 weeks in the Malaysian jungle, coming back, and they passed a truck coming in the gate, or going out the gate as they were going in the gate. And on the truck was the 2IC of the squadron, the pay rep, the head cook and the Q-store man, all leaving to go on leave, and there was no food, no money, no hot water, no nothing. That squadron nearly went off the deep end. It happens. It's a very simple thing to go right off your face over things like this. It's all you need. And later on in my career, having been in SAS for so long, you get to see how important other squadrons are, especially the base squadrons, to the successful operation of a combat squadron.
Well, they're basic needs, aren't they? They need to be met.
Of course they are. The needs of man. What are the needs of man? Shelter, warmth, food, water, and a bit of the other.
We can throw a few wants in there as well.
Oh, the wants and needs, yes. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
We're getting the wind up. How are we going, Denise? We've got a couple more minutes. Okay. So what was happening towards the end of your tour? How well had you been performing in your role in the bush?
Oh, we were very confident. I changed patrols, don't forget. I went to another patrol, and I really enjoyed my time in that second patrol. And we felt strong, we felt in command. Every patrol we went out on, we dominated. We dictated the actions. We initiated the actions. Ambushes were successful. We captured a fair bit of stuff. We lost nobody wounded even.
What was some of the most valuable stuff you captured?
Oh, money. Not me particularly, but the squadron. Money. An earlier squadron captured a radio. We captured a lot of weapons, a lot of documents. You're not dealing with an enemy that carries chandeliers around in their backpacks, you know. So valuables. You passed all the intelligent stuff back to the int people, the int pests as we used to call them. You passed all that back to them to contemplate their navel over and see whether there's any intel in it. And you only handed half the money in. You divvied the other half up amongst the blokes. Why
did you regard them as pests?
Well, that's just a nickname they got in SAS many years ago, and they've always had the nickname int pests. It's like the chooks are the signallers, and the int people are the int pests.
Would they pest you for...
Yeah, they pester you for information all the time, yeah. It's not meant as a derogatory thing. It's just you get introduced to blokes, oh, I'm the new int pest, you know. And that's just the way it is. But capturing stuff, yeah, you'd capture packs and rifles and bring them back, and they'd have a look at them and see, oh, this is an old Mosinagant, or this is an old Chi-Com AK-47 and it's very heavily pitted, or this is the new AK. We were the first squadron to spot the new the AKM, which was a heavier barreled version of the AK-47. We spotted one in an OP one day, and we came back and described it and allowed the int people, int pests, to build up a picture that supplies of these things had got this far down. I don't know, you'd see, Vietnam was a weird place. They used to have people who were carrying 2 mortar bombs all the way from Hanoi down to wherever, dump them off and go all the way back, get 2 more, 2,000 miles, you know. And you often see women carrying huge packs on their backs, no weapons or anything, just down the tracks, going like crazy down these tracks. Kids. Yeah, but anyone that was armed was dead meat though. We had no fire zones or free fire zones. They'd declare an area out of bounds to civilians. They do it by leaflet drop. They do it by posting, they do it by radio, they do it by posting posters all over the joint. They do it by word of mouth. Anyone caught in this area between this date and that date is dead, sort of thing. So if a patrol was in there and you ran into somebody, he's a Charlie, he's VC. We only ever opened up on those that had weapons anyway. Never ever fired on unarmed people.
You were mentioning before that you wanted to kill the cook, you wanted to take out the anger on people. Was that because you'd been there for such a long time?
12 months is too long. Too long to deploy a squadron, a battalion, a unit on a combat operation like that. They've known. That's why the deployments to Timor, Afghanistan and Iraq, max 6 months. So no, you suffer burnout. You are not capable of doing your job properly after that. And you start getting loopy. You start thinking, well, hang on. What are they going to do? Send me to Vietnam if I kill somebody? No, I'm already here. So the guy that murdered the bloke in 9 Battalion got life. He's been out for 20 years. Been out for 20 years. He was about 35 when he got out. I don't know, I don't think blokes think of that. I think they just think they get the red veil, the old red veil of madness comes over you. And we all suffered it. You all think that the only way out, the only way to do something about this is actually kill this person. Luckily, nobody in our squadrons ever did. A couple of our squadrons accidentally shot each other, shot and killed their own men, but they weren't done on purpose. It was absolutely an accident.
Is that why fragging starts happening, do you think?
Yeah, it does. It does. The Ashau Valley, they kept trying to force these blokes to go up this hill and they just kept getting killed, and the survivors said, we ain't doing it anymore, and started to kill their officers. The Americans lost a lot of officers killed in Vietnam through fragging. Hundreds, I'm talking hundreds.
Do you think that that was also because they were had a lesser education than yourselves and bad training?
No, I think the possum was being stirred at home. I think their political situation was completely out of control by the time they got to about the 1972 mark. By the time we came home, the American civilian thing had gone completely haywire. The rallies in the streets and everything were doing the communist job for them. Ho Chi Minh and these people just sat back and laughed their heads off because all the work they'd done was now being done by them, their own people. It's sort of happening in Iraq now. All the people railing against the Defence Force and the government for being there is doing the job of the enemy. Al-Qaeda could not have picked it any better. You know. Psychological warfare, PSYOPs it's called. Americans have invented the term and have done it for decades. They did it against the Soviets. That's how they beat them in the Cold War. It's being sort of reversed on them. And it's not a pretty thing. Now, I think our squadrons were... There was a discipline of the blokes that basically kept the lid on it. But there are a couple of instances where things could have gone completely haywire. People could have been killed. They weren't, so we move on.
Was that a direct decision after Vietnam with the 12-month tour to reduce it after Vietnam?
I think so. I think they realised that there were too many mad people out there after 12 months. I said to my father was spent 4 years away in the war. And I said to him, after a study had been done in Adelaide, that that the soldiers in Vietnam saw more action than our infantry guys did in World War II. And he was appalled. He was horrified. He was with the 2nd 13th Battalion, who the Battle of Ley and the Battle of Alamein, Syria and Lebanon and the whole bit, and then Borneo. I said, mate, the score's on the board. I did 180 days in the bush, and out of that, probably about 10 contact patrols, shoot-ups, over a 12-month period. I said, that didn't happen as often for you, and it's been proven. Oh, no, it hasn't. But anyway, we did. We were involved in a war that was pretty nasty, and we were getting a lot of flack from home, and it was one of those, it's where Punch a Postie and Whack a Wharfie came from. And to come home and have a bucket of red paint thrown all over the commanding officer of the 1st Battalion marching through the streets of Sydney was an absolute disgrace. The most disgraceful thing I've ever seen. But then the opposition, the other side, would say, oh, well, what's more disgraceful than the bucket of red paint? What about dropping a 10,000-pound bomb from 30,000 feet and not knowing where it's landing, you know? But when you put things in military terms, to me, throwing a bucket of red paint on a one of our hero battalions, was an absolute treasonous act. And a lot of our blokes waded into protesters when they got home. Blokes got locked up. Waded into them, smashed them. In Adelaide, 3 or 4 blokes got stuck into a great heap of people in a parade one day. It took about 10 cops to drag them off. They were going to kill all these people. And they were just back from Vietnam. So the red surge of anger and madness stays with you after a while, and you think, how am I going to get over this? And there's a lot of triggers along the way. A lot of these guys are in their 50s. I've been lucky, I've stayed in the army for 34 years. A lot of guys came home and didn't have that backstop. They got out, went back to their job as a bank teller in a local town in the bush. No one else in the bank can relate to his time away. He bottles it up, and all of a sudden, by the time he's 40 odd, he's a nutcase. Whereas I was still in the army with guys I served with in Vietnam, and I'm doing okay. You know, I'm not a TPI. A lot of my mates are, but I'm a gold card holder because I got more damage to my body from parachuting than anything else. And that just covers any medical and dental stuff I need done. But I'm not a TPI. I receive the element of a pension, but not the TPI. I still work. I run a business.
Do you think the TPI is directly related to the kind of response that Australia had for Vietnam vets when they came back?
Yeah, absolutely. Direct related. It's not related to the combat time. It's not related to, well, a bit of it is. To get shot at's the worst thing that ever happened to you. You really know. It's the only time in your life where you know that someone's trying to kill you. And that realisation sinks into your brain. It's a terrible thing. Someone's trying to kill me out there. And the rounds have just missed your head or something, or they've crump, 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 and you know he's there and he's trying to get you, and you've got to get in. And it's a terrible thing. And the realisation of that takes a long time to sink in, and they push it away. They bury it. And it'll bubble up. They'll see somebody they know, that they used to know, and who knew a bloke who got killed or something, and bang, out it'll come. Gee, I've seen blokes just dissolve on the side of the road, you know, out of the blue.
Did you get more nervous towards the end of your tour that something bad might happen to you when you're out on patrol?
No. I was more nervous at the early part of the tour because I didn't know as much as I should have. And towards the end of the tour, I wasn't bad. I wasn't a bad digger. You know, I could do the job. I was well considered by my patrol commander. My communications was good. I had mates. We came back. We had a lot of shoot-ups, and you know, it was good.
Can you tell me about your last day in Vietnam? What that was like?
Well, I was getting back talking about this before. On the Wednesday night, we're in this heavy action, heavy contact, way out near the border of Binh Thuy province, and we called on gunships and we couldn't get any, so they sent these dive bombers from Saigon. We got back on the Wednesday night, and we were just absolutely destroyed, and we were just so thankful to get out of there because I felt sure we weren't going to make it at the time. We got absolutely destroyed on the grog that night, and we couldn't go to Vung Tau for R&C because we were going home in 2 days. The next day was scrubbing our gear, and we were trying to do debriefs at the same time. Next day was scrubbing our gear and hanging gear in and all that sort of stuff. And the Friday we prepared basically to leave. We flew to Saigon that afternoon.
How many of you is there?
Squadron, 100. A little bit less than 100. Some had gone home already. Some had advanced party had gone home. Maybe 90. A 707 load anyway. And all the ones are from the Sydney side of the place. So I know less than that because some of the guys went on the C-130, the West Australian guys. But we're all from Sydney, so we all flew by 70. But we boarded about 8 o'clock at night. I thought, this is a bit weird, 8 o'clock on a Friday night. And we flew into Sydney at 3 o'clock on Saturday morning, 3 a.m. And it wasn't a sound. You know, I know there were curfews. I think they brought airline curfews in later when some of the big jets started to make too much noise. But 3 o'clock in the morning, and we were going through customs, and they put us through the hoops. I tell you, they went through our bags and everything. And I'm wheeling my trolley out into the area where all the people were waiting, and it was absolutely packed to the rafters with all their families. There they were. You couldn't hear a thing. There was silence, and then this huge roar, you know. And on the Saturday morning, I was home eating breakfast in my father's kitchen. I'd been in action 36 hours before. Very dislocating thing, you know. It wasn't debilitating. It was just, it was fantasy. It was one of those things that just didn't smack as being real. There was a lack of realism in it. I think, hang on. Whereas the guys who went home by ship had a couple of weeks to contemplate their navel, you know, as it were.
Is what you're saying that Vietnam seemed much more real to you than the life that you actually left behind and came back to?
Well, yeah, and I was only home about 4 or 5 days, and I couldn't wait to get out of the place. I wanted to hook up with my mates again. And we all went to a wedding in Victoria, and basically I never went home for a couple of years. I just didn't see them as my family anymore. It was funny. They were my family, and I loved my mother and my sister and my father, but it was different. Vietnam had changed everything. I had a long-term girlfriend when I left. When I came home, I said bye. And that was the end of that relationship. But coming home was a big deal. I was still only 22 at that stage, and getting home was one thing, but I just wanted to be with my mates. It's a terrible thing. I think being away for so long, your families change. And you don't mean it to be like that, but it just happens. You swap one family for the other. And those guys, we ran amok down in Victoria at a wedding and a couple of other things. And I basically never went home for a couple of years. So I went home the odd time, but it wasn't the same. So I had my own life to live on this side of the country.
Did your parents notice the change?
Oh, I suppose they would have. I've never spoken to my mother and father about it, but I was a 22-year-old that had been immersed in the shoot-ups of a war, you know. You just can't say you were going to be the same again. And some guys never handle it. I must admit, though, I was never, ever able to go off and do things like go to Rhodesia and fight in the bush war like a lot of blokes did.
How do you think Vietnam affected you?
It didn't affect me overly for many years.
So you felt pretty all right?
Oh yeah, I stayed in the army.
But obviously a bit toey.
Yeah, not bad. We were drunk for 5 years after we got home. And Jo rescued me. She's come here, married me and rescued me from all that stuff. Anyway.
Why was it important, do you think, to coagulate together with your mates pretty much as soon as you came back?
Because they could identify with what you'd been through and you then. And they were your backstops. They were your mates. They were the people who meant more than anybody.
Would you talk about stuff with them as far as your experiences?
Yeah, you do. But you reinforce in each other's mind how things were, and you don't blow smoke up each other's bums, you know, or you were a good mate, or none of that stuff. You just like to reinforce the fact that I'm still standing here because of you, without saying that, you know. Yeah, a fair bit of that.
How much of the protests and the media attitude from Australia was filtering through to you in Vietnam?
We were hearing a fair bit. We were hearing a lot in letters, and a lot of guys got clippings from newspapers sent up. And by that time we had a television set, a black and white TV, which we watched the landing on the moon on this black and white TV. Standing there, couldn't believe what I was watching. Armstrong landing on the moon. That
would have been quite a bizarre thing, being caught up in the middle of a war and watching
July 1969, right there. Here, the Yanks landing on the bloody moon. Unbelievable. Our laptop out there is 3 times more powerful than the computers they had on the lander. Unbelievable. How the hell they did it's got me beat. But it was such a moment. It was just a wonderful moment. But that black and white TV sat in the rec room. They set up a rec room with table tennis tables and all that sort of stuff. I think the Red Cross set that up. But nobody went in there. We'd rather stand in the boozer and talk to your mates. Just the way it was.
Did you have any interaction with the Red Cross?
No, not really. They were American, and they used to come there, and you'd be forced to sit in the mess and listen to their carries on, and they'd be trying to play games and I Spy with My Little Eye and all this rubbish. And the blokes would say, look, leave us out. We don't want any of this. No, they had their job to do, but it wasn't with us. There's got to be more people around deserving than us. All we want to do is stand at the bar and drink with your mates. Nothing else mattered. Just knowing, you know. I still remember every single one of those guys. A few of them are dead now. So still remember them too. Jimmy Rate drank himself to death. But, you know, everyone has groups of mates like that they relate to from school or from wherever. The wheat bins at Quindanny. Who, you know.
Sure.
Our mates, we were just getting shot at together, that's all. It's a big deal to get shot at. And shot at, the old 5 cent, 10 cent, I tell you what, you really know that you're in a... One thing about it, you really know you're alive. You panic, and the panic is so overwhelming, you want to run. But you don't. You stop. You go through the actions, you watch your mates back, you do all that stuff. That's what training is, you know. You train and you learn how to cope. And the coping mechanisms of soldiers are a little bit different to the coping mechanisms of other people. But they would be the same if you were shooting at those other people, you know what I mean? There's nothing like Sarajevo or any of those sort of dreadful places where the civilian population are continuously under bombardment. Vietnam was nothing like that. We had a pretty good war. You know, if you'd ever say that, we dominated the field. The Australian Army did an amazing job in Vietnam. They really did. They never suffered one single reversal on the battlefield. Never one single defeat in the whole time they were there. Long Tan was considered the biggest battle. The Battle of Coral, but not a defeat. The enemy was always defeated. And it's a proud record.
So what did you decide to do as far as work was concerned when you came home?
Well, I was scared to get out because I didn't want to go back to the war classing nonsense or get out of the army. I was in for 6 years anyway, and I'd only done 4 at that stage. So I had 2 more years to go. I wasn't going to cut and run. The NASHOs in the group did. Every single national serviceman that served with us got out, left. Only one ever came back, and he was a shearer, and it was too hard. He said, bugger that. He went on to be the RSM, Regimental Sergeant Major of the Parachute Training School. So he did 20 odd years. But I stayed in, and 5 years in, I was promoted to Lance Corporal, and by the time my 6th year came around and time to get out, I'd been promoted to Corporal, 2 stripes in SAS. And I thought, I'll give this a run. I had my own patrol. I was a Lance Corporal in New Guinea in 1971. We were getting ready to go back to Vietnam, so we'd just done all the build-up training again, then back to New Guinea with the new squadron, full of NASHOs.
You were ready to go?
Yeah, ready to go in November. September, October, something like that. Then they called the war off, and that squadron actually came home about that time. Did you actually look forward to going back or not? Sort of. I was going back as a patrol commander this next time. I was looking forward to that in a lot of ways, but I think we'd been there too long at that stage. I think it was time to come home. It was starting to get a bit stale, and you can't keep going to wars like that if the people at home are throwing rocks at you, you know. Just the way it is. There is a time to be there and a time not to be there, and I think it was time. We did the right thing by coming home. And the myth that Gough Whitlam pulled us out of Vietnam is always and has been a myth. Billy Hughes, Billy McMahon pulled us out of Vietnam. we'd come out before the election. We were home on the ground here. They had the election the same year, and everyone says, "Oh, Gough Whitlam pulled us out of Vietnam." No, he didn't.
As far as looking forward to going back to Vietnam, what was it that you were looking forward to?
To be the leader of a patrol. That was the creme de la creme. That's still the creme de la creme job in SAS, a patrol commander. That is the P job. And only the best guys are the patrol commanders. So to do that was basically fulfilling what I was meant to do.
Is that the training that you had in New Guinea, was that sort of all as a build-up to get you to that level?
Like it was when we went to Vietnam the first time. Training in New Guinea was a build-up and an introduction to the young blokes of jungle, mountains, all sorts of stuff. And we'd trained in Collie. We did most of our training in Vietnam in Collie and Ben Dune, for God's sake. So to get to a tropical country prior to going was vitally important. The rest of the army went to Canunga in Queensland and trained. We never did. We went to New Guinea for 2 months. They went to Canunga for 3 weeks. So we had a lot more time in the jungle. And the mountains. We get to Vietnam and it's flat as a billiard table. Except for a mountain there and a mountain over there.
How confident were you of your skills as a leader?
Good. I was a patrol commander in New Guinea as a Lance Corporal. I would have been a corporal patrol commander, probably promoted to sergeant when we arrived. Who knows? Just depending on the demographics at the time. But yeah, it would have been good. But it's not something I've ever contemplated. I must admit, I said, yeah, it was time to go. I think we'd had our time up there. Each squadron had done 2 tours. And it was not time to start the cycle again, you know what I mean? And there were a lot of national servicemen in that squadron that if it hadn't been called off then, and Gough Whitlam had got in the following year, he would have called it off anyway, and we'd have been up there for no time and come home. So yeah, it all happened reasonably. What
did you think about it being called off, so to speak?
Well, we thought it was a job not finished, and we thought once we realised the Americans weren't going to win, and they couldn't win because they were fighting the war wrongly, they allowed themselves to be bamboozled at the Paris peace talks. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese offered all sorts of things and then went back on it, a bit like Stalin with Hitler and Stalin, making pacts and then attacking each other. You know, it was ridiculous. So the peace talks were just a joke and just allowed the Vietnamese time to build up their forces. So
what you're saying is you weren't really surprised that happened?
No. Once they got the breathing space, they were gone, all for all money. If the Americans had shown resolve and kept going, and the people of America had been behind them, they'd have kicked the Vietnamese halfway across the world, just about. You wouldn't see Vietnam as you see it today. But it achieved the aim. They depleted the communist forces to such a huge extent that the domino theory just fell and it didn't happen. Thailand is now a democracy. We just had a free trade agreement yesterday. Malaysia is a prosperous democracy, sort of guided monocratic democracy. I think they have a king that comes in every 2 years or something. They swap it around. Singapore, safe. Laos and Cambodia look like they're being safe now. They look like, even though one of them has still got a communist leadership, the great bear of China and Russia, who hated each other as much as America hated them, their imperialistic tendencies have just been basically blown out of the water. The Americans stopped the rot, basically. I'm thankful for the Americans' efforts, but they just went about it the wrong way. They thought they could over-technologicalise the whole thing, bomb them into the Stone Age and she'll be right. They had to use their brains a bit more, like the Australians did in Fukui province. I think the Americans would have been far more successful.
Were you this politically conscious when you were actually in Vietnam?
No.
So what did you think you were fighting for at the time?
I was fighting for what my government told me we were doing. I was in the army. I was a soldier. And soldiers go where they're told to fight. I must admit I joined up because of the patriotic fervour that Long Tan instilled in me. the fact that the boys are fighting with their backs to the wall and needed help, basically. But we didn't question the army, we didn't question the government. The government said go to Vietnam and fight, and away we went. And that's what soldiers do. You cannot have a defence force which questions the government on particular actions. You can't do it. It just doesn't work.
So after you'd returned from New Guinea, what was next for you?
Well, at the same time the war was called off from our point of view, and then it was back to the regiment, and for the first time we had all 3 squadrons in the barracks. First time, and the place was like Pitt Street. It was packed. And I was meeting guys that had been in the regiment for 2 years I'd never met before. Because we'd fly to Vietnam, they'd fly home. So we'd be there for a year, they'd be, so 2 years, many guys you'd never seen before. And it was fantastic. So we're all down the Obi, down the Cottesloe, down the Albion, down the Highway Hotel, just getting on, It was, the war was over, who cared about soldiering? So, and we never went outside the gate for 3 years anyway.
Outside the gate?
Outside the barracks. Gough Whitlam was absolutely convinced, I'm sure, that we at the SAS were going to overthrow his government, and we never went anywhere. When Malcolm Fraser got back in, we started to go back to New Guinea, we started to go to Malaya again, we started to do all the things we used to do training-wise.
So there was absolutely nothing for you to do?
No, nothing. We lost so many good soldiers in that period, whole squadrons of soldiers left. We disbanded one of our squadrons. 2 squadron was dropped off the Orbat. And it only came back on in 1983, when the counter-terrorist thing really started to happen. Now we've still got 3 full combat squadrons, and they would never dare, any government would never dare drop one of those squadrons again. It takes so long to train, so long to arm, and so long to equip, that, and costly. To train an SAS soldier nowadays is worth a lot of money. And they're all bolting now to go to Iraq to earn big money, because, well, they're getting paid big money too. They're getting paid well. But I think the blokes that haven't been shot at are the ones that want to get shot at. They want to. It's a funny thing. To soldier for 15 to 20 years and never be in action is seen by a lot of guys as a waste of a career. I can't relate to that because I was in the army 2 years and we were being shot at. So my time in action happened early in my career, but there are other guys that came along from 1972 to 1980, that period, those 8 years there. And we had a lot of guys who did 8 years in the unit, who never saw an angry man, never went outside the gate, never went on an exercise. And you speak to them today, they don't have any memories of life in SAS because they did nothing. And then the counter-terrorist thing started to happen. Malcolm Fraser started to panic over the Sheraton bombing in Sydney, and we were given the nod to get together a fairly, well, a strong counter-terrorist effort, and I was involved in the early training of that.
And what sorts of things would you train?
Oh, they brought a British SAS training team out and charged the Australian government £100,000, 5 or 6 man team, and trained us in everything from sniping to demolitions to close quarter battle to hostage rescue to fast driving to whatever. All these quasi-military skills, or paramilitary, a lot of the police skills that we needed for the counter-terrorist game.
That sounds reasonably exciting.
Oh, it was, very much so. And on the ground floor, I was the team leader of Team 2. I was the sergeant, Alpha 1. We had an officer, and him and I were the team leaders for Team 2. We were able to sit back and watch Team 1 make all the mistakes, basically, and, well, not make mistakes, but we saw what they did and were able to mould our own ways to, in our view, do a better job. It wasn't their fault, it was just what that was handed down by these POMs. But all the skills were different. There was urban warfare, there was the use of submachine guns and pistols and both at the same time, and demolitions that we'd never seen before, industrial demolitions, sheet charges and all sorts of stuff, rappelling down the walls of buildings and jumping out of helicopters, and just all this different stuff that we'd come out of the jungle. We never did any of that in the jungle.
What's the difference between the anti-terrorism branch of the SAS and the TRG?
Well, the TRG, we trained the TRG. The TRG exists because SAS trained them. There's really, the big difference is they're police and SAS is not, and they can be used in any situation that the police deem. SAS can't be called out unless the Governor-General signs the bit of paper, which is good. We don't want soldiers on the streets anyway. Our democracy is quite fragile. Well, not fragile, but it's quite robust actually, but the way it's protected is that soldiers just do not take up arms on the streets. Well, nowadays with the terrorism thing happening, you do see soldiers and police together in some instances. The difference is SAs are counter-terrorists, not anti-terrorists. The anti-terrorists are ASIO and the federal police and all those, but they're anti. They stop it before it happens. Counter-terrorist is basically reactive. Once it's happened, you then react. The anti-terrorist is proactive. We're reactive.
With that branch, is it is protecting civilian life actually important, or is that more of a TRG thing?
The CT thing, when it first started, the main thing was to save the lives of the hostages. That was all. Invariably, the hostages were VIPs or civilians or kids or whatever they were, a bus load of kids. Save the lives of the hostages. That was the raison d'etre. That was the whole thing was based on that. Not kill as many terrorists as you can or retrieve the building, or it was always save the lives of the hostages. And it still is. Except that the terrorists have moved the ball game. They've moved the ball game to suicide bombs, and I don't think you can protect anybody from suicide bombs. Unless the anti-terrorist people have to. They have to know that firstly they're building the bombs, who's building them, where they're building them, and so on, and hit them before they can get out of there. Like the Israelis do. The Israelis bomb all those workshops all the time. That's where they make their built bombs. They can't just wait for them to come and blow kids up on buses.
Did you actually go on any counter-terrorist missions?
Nah, exercises.
Exercises.
So we were talking about your continuing involvement with the SAS, counter-terrorist.
I tell people I had the perfect career. In 27 years in the regiment and a couple of other units. 5 years for one stripe, 6 years for two stripes, 10 years for three stripes. I was a sergeant at 10 years. 15 years for warrant officer, class 2. 20 years for warrant officer, class 1, regimental sergeant major, not in SAS though, in the commandos. And then 22 years for captain, and I was a captain for 4, so something 23 years. I had the perfect career, and I covered most of the jobs. Never once did I do a job that wasn't combat related, except the last one, which was and the training job in Duntroon. But after we finished the counter-terrorist thing in 1981 on Gauntlet 2, the call sign was Gauntlet. Gauntlet 1, 2, 3 and 4. I was on the team of Gauntlet 2. The commanding officer, Rod Curtis, who rose to the rank of Brigadier, a lovely man, he called me into his office and promoted me to warrant officer and shook my hand warmly and said, "Well done, you've done a great job." And I said, "What job am I getting?" And he said, "I want you to go to base squadron as SSM, Squadron Sergeant Major, and learn some humility." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You've been a total arsehole." He said, "You've run your squadron here as if no one else existed." He said, "You've shown no sympathy or anything for trucks getting, trucks, medics, signallers, anybody." And I said, "Well, sorry, I was just too focused." And we were so focused on the job because we expected the baddies to strike any moment of the day and we were ready to go. And that's what we were doing, and therefore everyone else would have to do what we did. I failed to realise a lot of things, that they weren't getting the special pay that we were getting, but they still had to be there. So he sent me to base squadron, and I spent 12 months as a squadron sergeant major of base squadron. It's the hardest job I ever had, but a very rewarding job. I had medics and cooks and stewards and truck drivers and mechanics and all those guys. And I learnt that the regiment can't operate without the tail, and the squadron is only as good as the support group it has.
What were the difficulties that you had?
The difficulties? Well, the difficulties just the way I treated these poor buggers, you know. I didn't take into account that they were different to my squadron. They had different needs, and they weren't getting special pay. They weren't parachute qualified, therefore they weren't getting SAS pay. They weren't getting allowances. We were getting all sorts of allowances. They weren't getting any of it. They still had to be there to pick us up in their bus or their truck or their car.
Are these the same poor buggers you'd had a lack of consideration for before?
Yeah. So I went up there and basically told the counter-terrorist squadron that there'll be no more treating my men like this. So, sure, I turned it around fairly quick smart.
And what was your reputation like with these?
I was a good as Alpha 1 of Team 2. I'd lost one of my men killed in the killing house down the back at Swanbourne. He got shot in front of me. Little Pee Wee Williamson.
Is that during an exercise?
Yeah, just training. Bang, he was dead. Shot in the head by another one of my members. So my team was wiped out, my 4-man assault team. I had to get new guys in.
Were incidents like that rare during these exercises?
Oh yeah, it's only ever happened once in all that time.
What sort of inquiry was there into the incident?
Huge inquiry. The beauty of it was the inquiry pulled our SOPs apart, just dismantled them, and basically made us rebuild the SOPs. And the ironic thing about it, I was in England in 1985 on exercise logbook from Duntroon. I went to the School of Infantry at Warminster, and while I was over there I was able to get up to Hereford where the British SAS live. And the RSM up there, old Taff Richards, I knew him from years before. We're sitting in his office with our feet up on the desk drinking huge mugs of tea sort of thing, and he said, "What do you want to do while you're here?" And I said, "I want to catch up with a few guys." He said, "Who?" And I said, "Well, Jock Owens and Taff Sayer and and Ray Abbots." And he said, "Oh, you won't be catching Ray Abbots. Ray got killed last year." I said, "What do you mean he got killed?" And he said, "Well, he was shot in the killing house down the back." I said, "We never heard about that." And he said, "Oh, well, we'll get on with it." And I found out what happened. He got shot by the second man into the house, through the gluteal, through the sciatic nerve, and down into his femoral artery. And he died. They were working in the dark with NVGs, the night viewing goggles. And the second guy had a silenced submachine gun. Hadn't realised these things have got no recoil, these German submachine guns, and shot him in the arse, and didn't know he'd done it. Ray went down. They ran over the top of him and continued on shooting all the targets and stuff. By the time they got to Ray and got him down to the RAP, he dead. He died. But the terrible thing about it was they had an inquiry, and then it was found to be death by misadventure soldier on. When I was there in '85, I saw some of the most slack and dangerous practices still being practiced by soldiers with loaded weapons that we would never ever countenance anything like that after Pee Wee got killed. After Pee Wee got killed, we changed everything. We built things that'll never happen again like Pee Wee got killed. It'll happen some other way, because you can never predict everything.
I just asked, what were the circumstances that led to that incident with Pee Wee's death?
All I can say, without revealing any stuff that shouldn't be revealed, is basically that each man carries two weapons, a submachine gun and a pistol, and the pistol is the immediate action weapon of the submachine gun. In other words, if the submachine gun fails to fire, you don't stop and clear it like you do with a normal submachine gun or a rifle in the bush or whatever. you draw your pistol and carry on with the pistol. These guys were just sorting out their torches. Everyone carries torches and stuff, but she used the NVGs. Adjusting slings and things, and one guy just pulled his pistol and shot him in the head. Just like that. Just doing a drill that had been drilled into him time and time again. We used to do DPs, dry practices. And you'd load both weapons and go to action at the start of the day, and you'd work all through the day with your pistol still in its holster with a thumb brake done up, but around up the spout because you'd gone to action with both weapons. Okay, firing a submachine gun, clear it, come out, new magazine, go in, do it again and again. You might do 10 run-throughs and the pistol never gets touched until you have a stoppage. And if you don't have a stoppage all day, then the pistol never gets touched. So at the end of the day, you clear both weapons and go home. This guy just pulled his pistol out and did a DP, a dry practice, but forgot that he was in ready to go mode and shot him in the head. It was from me to that there away from me. It's there. I had my earphones up on my head, top of my head. It was the loudest shot I've ever heard. Terrible thing.
Why did he actually draw his gun?
He was doing a dry practice, immediate action. He's checking the length of his sling, shoulder sling, and dropped the weapon and just did a dry practice. Just a terrible thing. But we pull those SOPs apart, and that could never happen again. But the Brits didn't do any of that. They didn't change a single thing. So I saw some of the most dreadful bloody blasé crap. And at the time when Pee Wee was killed, CT was the thing. It was the top thing happening in SAS. When Ray Abbotts was killed, it wasn't the top thing happening in British SAS. It was about the third top behind a few other operations they had overseas against the baddies. Different sorts of baddies. They were working against all sorts of people, which we are now getting back into now ourselves. But at that stage, they were very blasé and very slack. And I was absolutely appalled that they didn't basically change their SOPs, and Ray died for nothing. And Pee Wee didn't. Pee Wee didn't die for nothing. He died in the cause. Everything was changed because of Pee Wee. And we've probably saved a lot of lives because of that. And the CT game, so I spent 12 months in base squadron, basically kicking the CT squadron up the arse for their misuse of the fuel up at the fuel point and all that sort of stuff, which I used to do myself the year before. And then
what kind of misuse are you referring to there, Nick?
Blake's not signing for fuel, that's all. We'd never know from one day to the next how much fuel was used because the guys weren't putting it on a bit of paper. The tank would be empty, but there's no signatures on the paper. You're supposed to write all this stuff on a running sheet. So we stopped all that and got it all fixed. Then they sent me back to the CT squadron as a sergeant major for the following 2 years. And we kicked some serious arse. We were a top squadron.
What were some of the achievements that?
We just had a very revved up outfit. We had all the Yanks beating a path to our door to learn our close quarter battle methods. I had Jim Wallace as my squadron commander. He went to Brigadier. He's now heads up one of those think tanks in Canberra. International something or other. He was as sharp as a tack, probably the smartest officer I ever worked with. He was a great man to work with because it was full on. Every day was full on with old Jim. Thought processes, you just couldn't keep up with him. He was amazing. Yeah, Jim Wallace. Worked with him, then Graham Ferguson actually the following year. And then I was posted out of the regiment for the first time for 18 years. I went to Duntroon. Duntroon in Canberra is probably the most important posting that an SAS warrant officer can do, because you're there at the coalface of the new officers, the brand new guys. All the good guys that I picked out over the 2 years that I was there have all served in SAS as troop commanders. Some of them have been squadron commanders, and the current commanding officer was one of my cadets. So it's it's a great fulfilment thing, and I really enjoyed Duntroon. The kids loved it, loved Canberra. Jo had a great time in Canberra. She had her own business there, and Duntroon was just the best, really. But 2 years, and away you go.
Sounds like a fairly influential role, Mick, if you
very
can hand select those people for the future ranks.
Oh, well, you weren't really hand selecting me. You were just identifying and planting a seed in their brain. Don't forget about SAS and the good guys, the infantry blokes, because all the good ones went to infantry. In the main, it's really you're not soldiering unless you're soldiering in some sort of infantry capacity. And a lot of people would dispute that, but that's the way it is. You know, it's the man on the ground at the end of the day that takes the piece of ground. You know. You can take ground with artillery or with tanks, but it's the infantry boy that holds it, sort of thing. And SAS is just a different kettle of fish altogether. You're thinking outside the square completely with SAS now. SAS is the flavour of the month, flavour of the year with the government. Since Timor, it's been sensational. The blokes that have served in Timor, Afghanistan and Iraq have had the best careers. They really have. They've got rows of medals. Some of them have got some serious decorations. One of my sergeants from, one of my diggers from Commandos when I was, getting back to the point, after 2 years at Duntroon, and I was in the field wing, looking after the field aspects of training. And the senior class was the old Duntroon. In 1985, the old Duntroon ceased. They ceased operating, and then 1986 became the Defence Academy next door. They built this huge university-type campus. And the 4-year degree that you used to get at Duntroon, you basically had to go to Defence Academy. They disbanded Portsea. Portsea was the other officer training establishment in Victoria. Disbanded that, sent all the instructors and the remaining cadets from Portsea up, and they became our cadets, and we made space in the sergeant's mess for all their silver and regalia, and we put their colours up in the Duntroon chapel. And it was all pretty emotional period, actually, because the Portsea people reckon they shouldn't have been disbanded, and quite stupidly they kept saying the Duntroon should have been. Unbelievable. Anyway, right next door they built another academy, so Duntroon became Portsea. In other words, an 18 months. If you went to the Defence Academy and did a degree, whether it was engineering or if you're Army, and don't forget all three services are there together. If you're Army, you came across to Duntroon to finish off your year. 12 months at Duntroon rounded you off as an Army officer, and you learned all those things that I was teaching in the bush. But if you come off the street and sign up to be a Duntroon officer, you have to do 18 months, so 3 6-month packages, and you graduate at the same rank of lieutenant as the guy next door. But he's got a degree and you haven't. So in the scheme of things, when they're picking generals, they'll pick the academy graduates, as they have done with Duntroon graduates. There's not too many people get past Brigadier that haven't been to Duntroon. If they haven't been to Duntroon, they haven't got much of a show at all. It's a little bit like the old British school system in a lot of ways. A fair bit of snobbery still there. If you're not Duntroon, you're not nothing, as they used to say.
You mentioned commandos earlier. What was the difference between the commando units and the SAS?
After Duntroon, I got promoted to Warrant Officer Class 1 and sent to the 1st Commando Regiment as the RSM. Now, that's an Army Reserve unit. It's a Choco unit, we used to call them. But they are sensational, the old one Commando Regiment. It was the only unit in the Army, the only Army Reserve unit in the Army where you could say, yes, this mob could deploy to war. They could go. And they were hard-working part-timers, basically. They used to call them waft hams and all sorts of things, but waste of fucking time and money. But that wasn't how I saw it at all. My first contact with the Army Reserve, and I'm the RSM of a unit. And I was very lucky to get an Order of Australia at the end of that posting. mainly because I think I related to the commandos. I related to what they were doing. I rated them. I rated them quite highly. Commandos are quite important to SAS anyway, because a lot of those diggers from commandos go across to SAS and become very good soldiers. The guy that won the big gong in Afghanistan was one of my diggers from one commando company. He was the one that brought in the airstrike and killed 300 Taliban and saved all those Americans' lives and downed choppers and all sorts of stuff.
Was that the bloke we saw on 60 Minutes?
Yeah, was it? Yeah, no, that was the digger that would work for him. That was signaller. I don't know. He's a signaller, but his patrol commander was one of my diggers in Choco over in one commando company, and other guys have gone across. Any number of commandos have crossed across to SAS and been very good soldiers. So it was a good posting to be in. It was the best posting outside the regiment, apart from the Duntroon thing.
Well, how would you compare a commando unit with SAS squadron?
Well, the beauty of the commando units is they're populated by a lot of SAS people now. All the ranks in the place are generally SAS. 4 battalion commando down in Sydney there. Everyone from the CO right down through the whole thing are all SAS guys. The squadron commander, the company commanders, and the squadron, the company CSMs, they're all SAS guys. And they're there particularly to pass that commando thing on to these guys. These guys do done any commando work before. They're not bad. They'll do the job, I tell you. But one commando regiment is an amalgam of one commando company and 2 commando company in Melbourne, and 126 Signal Squadron in Melbourne, which is now moved. And they brought all those 3 commando subunits into one regiment and made it a regiment. They've got their 50th anniversary next year, which I'm going over for. All the RSMs and all the COs and everybody will be there. And but they do a good job, but they've never been deployed. They've never been deployed. Well, they've had the odd bloke go to Vietnam and the odd bloke go to Timor, but they've never deployed as a company or a subunit.
But by definition, what's the difference between commandos and SAS?
Well, one's a choco mob, and they can't be deployed overseas for a start, even though Timor changed that. They started to send armed reservists to Timor. But there's an act of parliament, basically, that stops them going overseas. And the other main difference is that they're part-timers. They're every Tuesday night and 1 weekend a month. It's very hard to get the skills you need, the full-time SAS skills, at 1 Tuesday night a week and 1 weekend a month. You just can't do it. And you might have a 6-week camp or a month camp every so often, or a 1 week camp, but you still can't keep up. And the guys that do brilliantly. Some of them are very good. Some of them, it doesn't take much to get them up to SAS standard. Once they get across to the west, they get immersed in the 12-month training cycle that goes on before they're allocated to a squadron. And they come across with all those demolition skills and everything to start with. And that makes things far easier. They're also already parachute qualified. They're already maybe close quarter battle qualified. They're very good shots. They're fit, you know. So those guys are the main source of recruiting for a lot of the units. A lot of SAS blokes come straight from commandos. And it's good, but every time you take one, you've got to try and replace him.
Is it true to say, though, that the commandos in the Second World War were like a precursor to today's SAS?
They are, yeah. Yeah, they are. The double diamond outfits that were in Timor and all that sort of stuff, they do exactly what we do when we're in the jungle. What we were doing in the desert is what the British SAS were doing in World War II in the desert. But what we were doing in Vietnam and what they were doing in Timor and the islands is what we were doing in Vietnam. Oh no, we have a very close link with them. The Second Commando Squadron Association down here have just wound up their business because all their guys are too old now to do anything else. We had a big spread in our last, I'm the editor of the SAS Journal, Rendezvous, and 2 issues back we had a big spread on the second and their big parade up at Kings Park, and they are so old now, those blokes, but They were some tough cookies amongst that lot. God, they led the Japs a merry dance in Timor. They really did. The Japs had to deploy a division, 20,000 odd men to Timor to try and round them up, and they're only 100 strong. They did such damage,
They're cut off without radio, weren't they?
Yeah, Winnie the War Winner. That's what it was called. They came up on the radio after about 12 months and said, "We're still here." And they said, "Prove it." So all those parts and things were scavenged from the Japs from around the place, and they finally got comms. No, it was a great story. The Winnie the War Winner is actually in the War Memorial in Canberra. We've got photographs of it in our museum down at Fremantle there. There's a whole display there in the Fremantle thing of the 2nd Commandos and one of SAS in the other room, which we're quite proud of.
That story about Winnie would have to be of inspiration to any young signaller.
Yeah. But I think, I suppose a couple of our techs in our squadron could have built that radio. But you really have to have a technical bent. You really couldn't just be a signaller and build a radio. I wouldn't have a clue about any different parts of it, But those guys in those days did. I remember we used to build crystal sets at school, and that's really what they built, a big crystal set. I think they had valves and everything though. And they had a power source and all that sort of stuff. I think they had a generator they got going or something.
Brings home the importance of keeping up comms, though, I suppose.
Oh, well, you can't do the job without comms. The Bravo 20 is a good example of that. They sent the Bravo 20, which was a British reconnaissance patrol, an 8-man reconnaissance patrol, way up to the north of Iraq to set up an observation post and watch a main traffic route. But their communications were untested. They had radios that they'd never used before. Only one bloke in the patrol knew how to use it. And they never got comms from the start to finish. And when they wanted to be picked up and were desperate to get pulled out, they just couldn't tell anybody. Oh no, comms are absolutely vital. But nowadays they've got satellite communications and all sorts of weird things that I don't even know about. Not even cleared to know about.
I think earlier we were going to explore the incident with the Black Hawk helicopter.
Yeah.
Can you perhaps share with us your involvement or association to that incident?
Oh, well, I was the second in command of training squadron, my last posting in the army. I worked for some good men, Neil Thompson and Tim McCowan. And Tim McCowan's been back as commanding officer. He won a Distinguished Service Cross in Timor. He was the squadron commander, no, the CO, commanding officer, under General Cosgrove in Timor. And they kicked some serious ass up there. And when it happened, I was 2IC of the squadron, and I went up to the mess and all the families were gathering, and it was a terrible thing, a terrible, terrible thing. I knew every one of them. They'd come through the squadron, and one of them, Andy Constantinides, was one of my diggers from Commandos when I was RSM there, a couple of postings before. Little Andy, little Greek guy from Melbourne, tough little nut, said to me one day, I'm going to do the Carter. I said, good on you. Hope you go well. And I've come across and here's Andy running around the regiment. I said, oh, how you going? But next minute he's killed in bloody Black Hawk crash. It was a terrible thing, losing 15 blokes. It cost so much time and effort to train that many. That's probably 2 full selection courses of guys that you lose. That's millions of dollars. And millions of dollars worth of helicopters. And it was a terrible thing because there were 2 or 3 women, 21-year-old widows, stuff like that. There were babies. But it was, out of all that mayhem comes good. We kicked off the SAS Trust. We've raised $500,000. We've got that in trust, and the trust is run by Justice Malcolm. He's the chairman of our trust. And the role of the trust is to educate the kids of the guys who died. And we've got them all in private schools. We pay all their tuition till they finish. And one of the babies from from Andy, killed in Afghanistan. She was 2 weeks old when Andy died, so we've covered her. We've got her booked in St Mary's up at Carrinup, and we will pay for her education right through until she finishes. And the terrible thing about it is that it could have been worse. If it had been a C-130 crashing with 70 blokes in the back, and you got 100 kids without fathers, then that trust would have been broke overnight. So we wanted $10 million. Well, that's what we want in the trust, $10 million.
Where does that funding come from?
We raise it. We raise it.
How do you raise it?
Dinners, breakfasts. We have Mick, Woosher and Chris Conley have a breakfast every month or so, and we invite 150 people, and they pay $100 each to attend this breakfast, and that money goes into the trust. Those guys donate their time. We had a break and rant dinner recently down at the Sheraton. You heard about it, did you?
Yeah. Oh, I've heard about break and rant. I haven't heard about the dinner.
Oh, we had a big break and rant dinner, and we had 250 people there. We raised a few quid for the trust. I disgraced myself at that dinner. I got one of our mates, Phil Wilkinson, he's a winemaker from Pemberton now, and he had his gold medal winning Pinot Noir on the table, and I drank too much of it, didn't I? I haven't had a drink since. I don't drink very much anyway.
Apart from was it Moondale Brook? I saw it counter.
That bottle lasts 3 days, glass each day. That's all. When you get to my age, mate, you've got to have a glass of wine for medicinal purposes.
Don't worry, I've already started the medicinal program.
But the Black Hawk thing was an absolutely awful tragedy for the regiment and the people of Australia, and it took away an enormous amount of skill and fabulous soldiers, and you just can't, they don't grow on trees. But you're pleased to know that every one of those guys was replaced in that squadron by 7 o'clock the following morning. That was the combat squadron. So if we had to go to war, that squadron was had the guys replaced from another squadron. The ramifications of it were terrible. The blame game started, the inquiries and all that sort of stuff. The terrible, I spent so much time in Katacara Cemetery watching funerals, it was just awful. Had about 9 funerals in a week at Karakata. And you look at those guys and they were just young blokes coming through the regiment. They were me, they were just, it happened to them, not me. So you can't predict it, you don't worry about it, you just try and get on with your life. Like I said, if a C-130 crashed with a squadron, we had 3 guys on a C-130 that crashed in the Philippines. There were 29 people on board. We only had 3 people on board that. We could have had 8, but the other guys were waved off. The other patrol ran up to the back of the Herc. The thing was churning and burning on the strip, 2 of them. They ran up to the back of the first Herc, and the loadmaster said, "Full, go to the other plane." So they did, they ran around and got on the other plane. First one took off and crashed into the bay, crashed into Subic Bay in the Philippines. They were Talons too, they were black Talons, which are these seriously secret C-130s the Yanks had. They still got, but when the Cold War was on, they were so chock-a-block full of electronic sensors and things, you could hardly fit anybody in these damn things. Anyway, he flew out over the mountains and down over the bay and winged it over the bay, and one of the wings into the water. One of the guys survived. The navigator survived the crash. He woke up with a broken leg on a fishing boat. He had no idea what happened. He bent down to pick up his pencil as they banked. That's all he remembers. He was just projected out of the plane somehow. Everyone else was killed. 3 of our blokes were. And that was a terrible tragedy, because Ewan Miller, the guy one of the sergeants that died, introduced Joe and I at that party. I was telling you about earlier on. I was dressed like a skank. So it was a terrible tragedy to lose him. He was a guy of great knowledge and an important member of the regiment. So as were the other 2, a sergeant and a signaller. But you just thank your lucky stars. Every time the boys went to Iraq, I never lost anybody wounded or killed. unbelievable. And they were in action more than we were in Vietnam, for God's sake. It's just fantastic soldiering. The blokes really had the wood on these guys. They had the wood on the Iraqis so heavily that the Iraqis never stood a chance. I think the Iraqis thought initially that the SAS boys were on foot, like the Brits were in the first Gulf War. But we would make that mistake again. The blokes were armed for bear. They had all the gear. And before you knew it, the Iraqis had vehicles shot out from under them, all sorts of things. They captured lots and lots of Iraqis and sent them home, took their guns off them and sent them home.
How much knowledge do you have of their operations in Iraq recently?
Not much, no. Not much. About the same as you. No, they did well. I know the blokes, they're just young outfit blokes. The squadron commander I know him well. They just did the job. Did the job because they had that extra element, that need to win thing, and they did. They really got stuck into it. Same in Afghanistan. Afghanistan was a bit different up in the mountains, freezing cold, 25, 30 below, you know. The Americans had pulled out of the mountains because it was too cold. Our guys stayed there for a further 2 weeks, for God's sake.
How do you think Australians' perception of Vietnam veterans has changed over the years? If you think it has.
The two welcome home parades we had were welcome for veterans to put to bed some of the demons. But I saw an old RSL bloke standing on the side of the road in Sydney, and the big Back from Vietnam March, what it was called, with a sign saying, "We forgive you." And a couple of blokes were going to rip the sign off and shove it down his throat, basically. That hurt because we thought, hang on, what do we need to be forgiven about? We were doing the bidding of this country. The people of Australia basically were fair enough, there were two sides of politics. One side was louder than the other. The loud side basically got up, as it did in America. Vietnam, in hindsight, was a flawed concept, the old domino theory. It's been disproven. But at the time it was, that was the thinking of the day. We didn't have any politics, we just did the job, we wanted to serve, we were soldiers, regular soldiers. But to come home and see ourselves being spat at, and no one ever spat at me, I'll tell you now. They wouldn't want it if I was broken their neck. And a lot of my mates the same. A lot of my mates have been in trouble for punching people, for doing stuff like that, saying stupid things like baby killers and stuff like that. We never killed anybody that wasn't armed. We killed a lot of people, but they were all armed, I tell you now. Every one of them. Because in jungle you're dealing in a very close area, you know, you're not bringing in airstrikes from miles away that you can't see. And with the people of Australia, Vietnam was a terrible thing. But we moved on. I think Vietnam veterans bottled it up for years and years, and then all of a sudden it's broken out. And the Vietnam Veterans Counselling Service was very important in dealing with this in the early days, and Veterans Affairs eventually agreed to take it over and fund it and call it Veterans Counselling Service. And that's still in place today, and that's done a valuable service, but there are still a lot of mad people out there. 55,000 people went to Vietnam. We got 25,000 TPIs. A lot of them are World War II and Korea, so it's not all Vietnam. But Vietnam wasn't a cathartic thing. It was a very brain-numbing thing for a lot of people to be involved in, especially people who've lost people killed. We lost no one in my family in World War I or World War II, and we lost a third of our commitment in Vietnam. 1 out of 3. I don't see any. I'm not bitter. I'm not bitter of the government at all for having us there. That's why we were in the army to do the government's bidding. But I'm bitter about the distortions and the stuff that went on later. I really am. And to me, the Gough Whitlams and the rest of those fellow travellers who did everything they could to dirk us and cut us down and make us less than, the red paint brigade. I can't believe it, and we put up with it. We had to because we were still serving. So you couldn't do anything about it. And then to stand there at SAS and have Bob Hawke and Gordon Scholes and Kim Beazley was the only one out of all those people who give a damn about the army at all, about the Defence Force. None of them give a stuff. Not a single stuff. And I think history will prove that Labor would rather roll over than fight,
Well, on that philosophical note there, Mick, just want to thank you
John
very
Curtin
much.
was good.
Just want to thank you very much for talking to us today for the archive. You've been sitting in the hot seat for quite some time and you've done a marvellous job. So
Well, thanks very much, and I hope it's of use.
it will be, I'm sure.